solve the Gaza question and maybe even solve the whole Palestinian question. And now that opportunity fell into their lap. Hamas tried nonviolent civil resistance. What did they get for it?
Definitely the profile, I think that's a good way to think about it, of the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian liberation cause has been raised globally. Now, obviously, that's at a horrible cost.
By October 6th, 2023, Gaza had been forgotten. I don't believe they had thought through the consequences. In my opinion, it was an act of desperation. They rolled the dice. Was the result a disaster? Yes, I think that has to be acknowledged. Netanyahu is confident that he will, and this is what he cares about, and it's a deep-seated commitment by him. He will be known as the person who liberated the whole land of Israel. That people were exterminated, that people were expelled, nobody's going to remember. He's going to occupy, in his mind, the honored place of having liberated the whole of the land of Israel.
It's been 2 years, almost to the day, when October the 7th happened. I think few of us then could have imagined exactly what has unfolded in Gaza and the impact that it's had. The first question I want to start with, and it's probably a question which you are reluctant to answer because it has various moral sort of complications, but the question is going to be, do you think Hamas regrets doing the attack that they did on October 7th 2 years ago?
That's a tough question, frankly. First of all, I can't read the minds of Hamas, and most of their leadership has been assassinated, so it's not going to be possible to hear their opinions after 2 years. I think, in my view, one should have no illusions about what happened on October 7th. I don't believe they had a grand strategy. I don't believe they had thought through the consequences. In my opinion, it was an act of desperation. They had reached a point where all of their available options had been exploited, and they reached a dead end. If you look at the real history, as against the fictitious or fabricated history of Gaza, Hamas tried diplomacy. There was a period around 2009 when Hamas was clearly interested in some sort of, to use the fancy Latin term, a modus vivendi, meaning a way of coexisting with Israel. So there were discussions about accepting the international consensus for resolving the problem, namely the two-state settlement. There was discussion about a long-term ceasefire, a hudna, as it's called, and all of those attempts to reach some sort of modus vivendi with Israel proved a dead end because Israel was not interested in a negotiated settlement. It wanted an abject surrender. They tried international law. Now, people might greet those words with skepticism or dismiss them, but that's the factual record. The factual record shows that after each of Israel's killing sprees in Gaza, what it calls its operations, or sometimes it calls its mowings of the lawn, after each of those high-tech killing sprees, there were various commissions of inquiry dispatched to Gaza, and there were also the human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, which went to investigate what happened during these high-tech killing sprees. Now, it's important to keep in mind, neither the Commission of Inquiry or the various human rights organizations were at all sympathetic to Hamas. Hamas was an Islamic organization which alienated it from the liberal human rights organizations like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. And the Commission of Inquiries were formally objective, but in fact, in my opinion, and it's not just an opinion, I've written to the point of tedium on the subject, they were always hostile to Hamas. I mention all this because whereas Israel refused to cooperate with any of the UN commissions of inquiry, and whereas Israel refused to cooperate with any of the major human rights organizations, Hamas did. It knew it wasn't going to get a fair shake from these organizations or commissions. It knew it wouldn't get a fair shake, but it still cooperated. You're old enough to remember it cooperated with the Goldstone report. Now, Richard Goldstone, this is after Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9. Richard Goldstone was not just Jewish, he was an avowed Zionist by his own self-description. So you can imagine Hamas was not expecting a fair shake from Richard Goldstone. That was the UN Human Rights Council Commission after Operation Cast Lead. They still cooperate. They still cooperate in the hope that even if they didn't get a fair shake, at least they would get or extract some justice. They got nothing. You might remember what happened with the Richard Goldstone report. It created a huge international furor. Israel was enraged by Richard Goldstone's findings. And then what happened? April 1st, 2011, he dissociated himself from the report. That's what they got from trying to cooperate with international law. He rescinded the report in his name. Then they tried nonviolent civil resistance, the Great March of Return. That began March 30th, 2018. They tried. Everybody said, where is the Palestinian Gandhi? Where is the Palestinian Gandhi? Well, in fact, there have been many Palestinian Gandhis, but we'll leave that aside. Hamas tried nonviolent civil resistance. What did they get for it? I will even admit to you, I was in touch with people in Hamas. I encouraged that strategy. I thought it would work. I thought there was a good chance the nonviolent civil resistance could work. What happened? We know exactly what happened. There was a UN Commission of Inquiry. It published a report, 250 pages, single-spaced. It was a very detailed report. What did the report find? It found that Israel lined up along the perimeter fence with Gaza its best snipers. Israel later said every bullet hit its target. Every bullet hit its target. What targets did it hit? Well, according to the report, they targeted children, medics, journalists, disabled people, persons with double amputees. They targeted them 300 meters from the perimeter fence when they were engaging in strictly civilian activities. Because you might remember, the Great March of Return began as a festive occasion. There were plays, there were music, there was dancing, there were picnics. And what did they get for their festivities? Double amputees targeted by Israel's best snipers. By October 6th, 2023, Gaza had been forgotten. That's a fact. It's easily unremembered now, but I remember it very well. You know why I remember it well? Because I myself had given up. I thought it was pointless at this point. I had devoted 42 years of my life to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And Gaza had vanished. If you recall, by October 6th, the only talk in the town was about whether Saudi Arabia would join the Abraham Accords. There was no longer any talk of Gaza. So within that context, I think that you have to remember, and here I admit it's speculation, but I think it's grounded speculation. Sinwar, the head of the military wing of Gaza, he had been in prison for 20 years. And then he was released in the prisoner exchange. And as he said, I went from one prison to another. I went from the Israeli prison where I was incarcerated, I went to Gaza, I went to another prison. And so his vision, he has a tunnel vision, very narrow. He doesn't think it's not physically possible to think in global terms, in terms of the international balance of forces. It wasn't within his capacity, given his physical environment. So I think it was just an act of desperation. It was a roll of the dice. Let's see what happens. Now, what happened was a disaster. But I don't blame them. I'm not trying to cast a radical pose or to be, trying to show how radical I am. I'm just saying factually, I have studied the situation closely. I studied strictly Gaza for 15 years. They had no options. They were left with one option. You know what their option was? To languish and die in a concentration camp. That was the only option they were left with, to languish and die in a concentration camp. And so, recoiling at that prospect, they rolled the dice. Was the result a disaster? Yes, I think that has to be acknowledged. And those who were knowledgeable, even though you have to read between the lines, people like Sayed Nasrallah, if you recall his first speech, and you should go back and listen and maybe use it as a clip in this interview, you could see he was peeved. He said, they didn't warn us. They didn't tell us. I think that's true. And you could see he was not happy about that fact. Because Sayed Nasrallah, whatever you might think of him, he was a very smart guy, and he had a very broad vision. He did what a serious political leader does. He got up every morning, and his first order of business was to read all of the Israeli newspapers in translation. He had very good translators. Read all of the Israeli newspapers in each morning, and he had a very detailed knowledge of Israel, but he also had a very detailed knowledge of the international balance of forces. And he knew this was no good. It was a disaster. He tried desperately to carve a middle road between, he is the head of the resistance. He's got to do something for Gaza, or he loses all credibility. But he knows if he goes too far, Israel is going to do to Lebanon what it did to Gaza. So he tried to carve out a middle road. It was unsuccessful. There was no middle road. And if you recall his very last speech before he was assassinated, he said, we have to be honest, Israel has the technological edge. And that was his way of saying, this was not the time for a frontal confrontation with Israel. They have the technological edge. He understood that. But Hamas didn't think about technological edge. Hamas didn't think about the international balance of forces, Hamas just thought we have two choices: to die on our knees or to die on our feet. They chose to die on their feet. I'm not trying to make them out to be heroic or martyrs. I think it was an act of desperation, but I have to add that I did not see any other options. I myself had walked away. I had started to read on new subjects, and I'll be honest, I felt kind of mentally liberated. My mind was steeped and stuck in this Gaza issue for 15 years. And I'm an older man now. I wanted, before I died, to read something else, to do something else. I felt very guilty about it. But on the other hand, the last book I wrote on the subject was called I Accuse. It sold 350 copies, as my publisher sadly reported. And of those 350, I purchased half, because it was for the internet. It was on a case before the International Criminal Court about Gaza. And I was hoping to influence the court decision. And at that point, I said to myself, what are you doing? Nobody's reading this. Nobody's interested. So I had moved on. And I don't believe they had options. You know, some people say, well, why do they have to target civilians? Why didn't they kill military targets, soldiers? Well, they did kill soldiers, as you know, about 1/4 were soldiers. But ask yourself a simple question. In the real world, as against the fantasies and the propaganda, ask yourself a simple question. If Hamas had killed not 800 civilians and 400 soldiers, but let's say they killed 1,200 soldiers, okay? Technically legitimate military target. Would that have won them any sympathy? Can you imagine? Israel is a Sparta-like society. What distinguishes a Sparta-like society? The bottom line is they attach more value to a military life than a civilian life. If they had killed 1,200 soldiers, combatants, I think the reaction would have been worse. Do you really believe the international community would have said, well, Hamas targeted soldiers, so it was okay? Can anyone possibly believe that? So there weren't options. There weren't options. You can, in my opinion, you can do two things at the same time. You can acknowledge atrocities of a high magnitude were committed on October 7th, and you can simultaneously refuse to condemn the perpetrators of those atrocities. And that's my position. My position, go ahead.
Yeah, go for it.
My position is exactly the same as during the slave revolts in the 19th century. You can say what they did, and in the largest slave revolt in our country's history, the Nat Turner Rebellion, and the order given by Nat Turner was, quote, kill all white people. And that's what they proceeded to do. Every white person in their path, man, woman, child, baby, they killed them all in brutal ways. You could say Nat Turner and his Confederates, they committed atrocities. And you can also say, well, you know what? The Nat Turner Rebellion occurs in 1831. There was no possibility of them being freed in their lifetime. The Civil War doesn't come for 30 years later. The Civil War comes in 1860-61. There was no possibility. And then you ask yourself a question. Is it right that they should have to accept being born into, live, and die a slave? Because that's what you're saying. You're saying there was no possibility of peacefully ending slavery in 1831. Now, you have only one life to live, one earthly existence. If you refuse to forfeit your life to being a slave, if you refuse to forfeit your life to being a slave, do I have the right to condemn you? No. No, 1,000 times no. It's not going to happen on my watch. I will not condemn them. But I will acknowledge that atrocities of a significant magnitude occurred on October 7th.
Okay, we've obviously seen Israel's genocide. It's been depraved. You previously mentioned in an interview to my colleague that to try to understand it now through facts and visuals isn't enough. It now belongs in the realm of fiction for you to maybe start getting your head around just how cruel the conditions that they've imposed in Gaza are. At the same time, I mean, you mentioned that after 42 years of study, you were almost on the brink of walking away from the story.
I did walk away.
You walked away from the story.
I wrote a new book. It was 600 or so pages on a completely different subject. I had walked away.
So you walked away. And I mean, for the last 2 years, you're almost giving interviews daily now on Palestine and Israel.
Don't mind me correcting you, and you could stop me and say, no, let me finish.
Yeah.
Actually, I've given very few interviews. It's very deceptive. I've not been asked on any national program, none. You can look in the United States or in the UK. The only exception, a partial exception, was Piers Morgan's program. Other than that, no. You will, if you were to Google the title of my book, which is the only scholarly history of Gaza, political history. Sarah Roy of Harvard wrote a very excellent economic history. Mine is the only scholarly political history. You will not see any references to it, none. It's an optical illusion. I say it's an optical illusion because through the miracle of the web, you can be a tiny podcaster. And because people know that I know what I'm talking about, even a tiny podcaster will get 500,000 views. But that's not because I am being interviewed all the time. Very far from it. Even now, we're heading towards October 7th, the 2-year milestone. I've not received any requests for interviews. It's not true. I've actually only been once in 2 years. I've only been once in Al Jazeera English. The Al Jazeera Mubashir wants me, but Al Jazeera English, no, because my views are considered unacceptable. They're outside the spectrum, even the extreme ends of the spectrum. My views are outside it. So, as you know, I'm sure, the standard question of Piers Morgan was, do you condemn what Hamas did? I was the only one with a scholarly background. There were some people who want to pretend to be radical, and show how pose for the cameras, but they were obviously imbeciles, and Piers Morgan liked to have them in the show, so you can show the world only imbeciles would say something stupid like that. I was obviously not an imbecile. And if you watch the programs with Piers Morgan, he doesn't have me on anymore. Piers Morgan Uncensored censored me. The program is called Piers Morgan Uncensored. He censored me. But he always treated me very deferentially. He would say, Professor Finkelstein. And he never once, I was on 8 times before he terminated me. He never once challenged a single fact I stated. And as you can see, the facts I have to say don't fit with the quote unquote narrative. Never once. So there was no question I was knowledgeable. For God's sake, if I wasn't knowledgeable, I truly wasted my whole life because that's all I studied. I'm not proud of that. When you have regrets when you come to the end of your life. And one of my regrets is my range was so narrow. I was like Sinwar. Really, I was the same narrowness and tunnel vision, So I was never asked. I've not been asked, even for the October 7th. And last year, the first year milestone, no one asked. It's all an illusion. Because it's true, my profile now was high. If I walk out in the street, within 5 miles, there will be at least 5 people who stop me and ask for a selfie with me. So I'm known, but that's only because of the, as of now, the freedom of the web. That you can be a podcast that normally has 11 views, and then they hear Finkelstein is on, and because you can get the I don't know anything about the web, but you can get a signal that this is a Finkelstein program, and so people can go. And so a podcaster who normally gets 11 views will now get 110,000 views. Yeah. The powers that be are now fixing it, repairing that problem with what they call rigging the algorithm. And yes, I'm suffering. I could see that I'm paying a price for that. But no, I've not been interviewed. Look, it's the price you pay. There's the expression, there's gatekeeping. And the gatekeeping litmus test was, do you condemn? People like Mehdi Hassan, they condemn. You go back and look, they all condemn. And they no doubt thought I was crazy. Literally crazy, not like I'm doing something stupid. How could he not condemn? And the truth of the matter was, it was a very hard question for me. It was a very hard question for me. Once it became clear the extent of what happened on October 7th, I really sweated. In the literal sense, I sweated, trying to figure out how do you morally navigate this question. Under normal circumstances, I'm not proud to say, look, I'm over 70, but I would have picked up my phone and asked Professor Chomsky, where does he stand? Because Noam Chomsky was my mentor for 40 years. He had very refined moral judgment, political judgment and moral judgment, and they're different. He had very refined political and moral judgment, and I would have solicited his opinion, and almost certainly I would have agreed, but he wasn't available. And I had to think it through on my own. And for about a week, I knew people were curious where I stood because I was the only one who had written on Gaza. So people would want to know where I stood, and they respected me, to the extent that I was a known quantity. People respected my opinion because they knew you can say anything you want about me, and there'll probably be some truth to it. But there's one thing that you can't say about me. You can't say I can be bought. There's no possibility. If somebody asked me to change one period or one comma in a book, I wouldn't do it unless they convinced me that it was a bad use of the period or comma. Of course, I can be persuaded because I'm not infallible. But if it was just for money, if it was just for political reasons you want me to change it, it's not going to happen. It will never happen. Well, now it's too late because it's coming to the end of my life, but it's never happened. I can't be bought, period, full stop. I know that, and everybody else knows that. I can't be bought. I can't be purchased. So people were curious as to my judgment, and I struggled with it. And until I hit on the analogy with the slave revolts, I was stuck. And then when I started to read about the slave revolts, then I felt I was on firm ground.
Okay, thanks for the segue. I think it's been a good reflection in terms of capturing what we want to actually talk about later in the interview as well, which is media complicity, and I mean to a large extent complicity by Western powers, by many powers in the region, etc. But just coming back to what we were speaking about, because we've seen this crazy, cruel depravity of Israel, and definitely the profile, I think that's a good way to think about it, of the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian liberation cause has been raised globally. Now, obviously, that's at a horrible cost to what's happened in Gaza. Again, very difficult question because we can't weigh these things. But how do you sort of counterbalance? Where does that leave you in terms of what you think? I mean, you said you walked away from the cause. Do you think the Palestinian cause now is healthier or not?
No. Look, I don't want to throw cold water. And we have to recognize at a terrible cost, at a frightening cost, at a ghastly cost, yes, some things changed. If you take my own city of New York, okay, there is no possibility whatsoever that Zoran Mamdani could have won the Democratic Party primary and is now presumably, we don't know yet, but will be the mayor of New York, with his political opinions, were it not for what happened on October 7th and thereafter. There's no possibility. Public opinion changed so radically. However, one has to always, there was a famous Hungarian Marxist philosopher named Lukács, and he once said, you have to always look at the present as history. You have to look at the present within the context of history. I've lived to see many turning points. There was a very big turning point change in public opinion after Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Now, you probably don't remember, but in the course of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, Israel killed between 15 and 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians. And there was a big international reaction to that. You remember, it was the first Arab capital that had ever been bombed. They were bombing relentlessly Beirut, especially in August 1982. Did it endure that reaction? No. I remember the reaction to the first Intifada, which was overwhelmingly nonviolent, and Israel was brutally repressing it on camera. As you might recall, the defense minister at that time was Yitzhak Rabin, and the policy he declared was force, might, and beatings. And they were breaking the bones, literally. We're not using hyperbole here or poetry. They were literally breaking the bones of the children who were throwing the stones. And that elicited a very negative reaction internationally. Did it endure? No. Now I'll come up closer to the present. You probably have forgotten, but during Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, there were some of the largest demonstrations in British history that occurred opposing the Operation Cast Lead. I wrote a little book on it. I took the title of the book from an article by the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy. The book was called "This Time We Went Too Far." And because at the time, it seemed like something spectacular had happened, what Israel was doing in Gaza. It's now, when you look back at it, they killed 350 children, which was considered an astronomical number at that time. Now they've killed about 30,000 children. They destroyed 6,000 homes. Now they've destroyed about 250,000 homes. They left behind then 600,000 tons of rubble. This time they've left behind, as before the destruction of Rafah and before the destruction of Gaza City, the estimate was 50 million tons of rubble. But at that time, it seemed like Israel had crossed the threshold. This time we went too far. Forgotten. Who even remembers Cast Lead at this point? So whether this change in public opinion will endure, I think it's a question mark. What I would say is the following. Prime Minister Netanyahu is confident people will forget. They won't remember. That's why he persists. For Netanyahu and his cohorts, this is October 7th was a godsend. It was what they had been waiting for and hoping for decades, to once and for all solve the Gaza question and maybe even solve the whole Palestinian question. And now that opportunity fell into their lap. And there is no way on God's earth they are going to let go of it. They will not let go. They understand this opportunity will not come again, certainly not in not just this lifetime, but several more lifetimes. It won't come. And they want to solve the Gaza question, but also solve the Palestinian question in general, which means cleansing the West Bank, ethnically cleansing the West Bank. And you might ask, but what about the bad PR? What about the international condemnation? First of all, they're not going to let that stop them. This is that opportunity. But secondly, they're probably right. People will forget. You know, you take the American presidents. I'm speaking now of my own country. Every American president, up until and include, no, actually beyond Lincoln, every American president was involved, was implicated in the extermination of the Native American population. Everyone, because it was a protracted process. The U.S. began on the East Coast and slowly moved west until finally California. So every American president, because it occurred over, it begins in the 17th century and it doesn't end till the 20th century. It doesn't end until the 20th century. So it's a very incremental process. And every American president was involved in the extermination and ethnic cleansing of the Native population. Has it dented any of their reputations? Does anybody say, well, George Washington, he did X, Y, and Z, which is good, he did good things, but he was known, which he was known by the Iroquois Indians. He was known as, quote, the town destroyer. That was the nickname they gave him, town destroyer. Does anybody mention that? Does it taint his reputation? And in the same way, Netanyahu is confident that he will, and this is what he cares about, and it's a deep-seated commitment by him, he will be known as the person who liberated the whole land of Israel. That people were exterminated, that people were expelled, nobody's going to remember it. He's going to occupy, in his mind, the honored place of having liberated the whole of the land of Israel. And I think there's a good chance, in my opinion, there's a good chance he will succeed. Remember, just a few years ago, MBS in Saudi, somebody walks into his embassy to get some sort of certification for a marriage, and his bones are ground to dust. His bones are ground to dust. Not a very nice wedding present. And you might remember people like Joe Biden said, I will not have anything to do with that man, and so on and so forth. How long did that last? Who remembers? You know, people remember the victories, not the defeats, not the underside. So I think his calculation is correct. 2 or 3 years from now, it'll all be forgotten, and all of what they call Eretz Israel will have been liberated from the non-Jews.
Now, given obviously the history of the conflict since 1948, the ethnic cleansing, and given the hindsight of what we can see now for the last 2 years, I think it's very clear that we know that this preparation will not stop. It's probably been clear for like the last year that this wouldn't have stopped in the year that has preceded.
Well, I don't think that's actually true, because everybody seemed to believe in these ceasefires.
No, but
it was perfectly obvious. Do you remember there was that 3-step ceasefire?
I do. This goes back to like March 2024, yes.
There was the talk about the reconstruction that was supposed to be the third stage. You remember the reconstruction? And I'm saying, what are you people talking about? Israel just devoted a whole year to turning Gaza into rubble. And you think after devoting a whole year to turning Gaza into rubble, they're going to now sit down and say, Kumbaya, give peace a chance and let's rebuild Gaza? It was so crazy what people were saying. There was no possibility of that. They will not relent until Gaza is Arab-Rhine. You know, there was the Nazis, the clean of Jews, Judenrein, and this is Arab-Rhine. They will not relent until Gaza is Arab-Rhine.
When did that become clear to you? Like, so for example, I think your first appearance on the Piers Morgan show was probably a month post October 7th, right? So at which point, I mean, to me, it became clear probably around about April or March 2024. To some people, it's still not clear, and I think we get various people who are in denialism about it, perhaps even today. But when did it become clear to you that Israel has, I mean, they were always going to take advantage of this opportunity and create massive destruction, but that they were literally going to create as much rubble as they can, not care about human life, only to the extent that their propaganda can still win. They care about it only to that point. When did that become crystal clear to you when you were viewing this conflict?
I can't pinpoint a date, but what I can tell you is the following. I just read the UN Commission of Inquiry report on whether Israel is committing genocide. The one that was put out about 2 weeks ago by Navi Pillay. And you know what was the most striking thing about it? One of the most striking things about it was, if you look at the statements made on the first 2 or 3 days by the Israeli government, the statements by the Israeli government, they did exactly what they said they were going to do. Go look at the statements. It's worth it, you know, for your listeners to look at the statements. They said they were going to reduce Gaza to rubble. That's what they said. We're going to reduce Gaza to rubble. They said that there are no civilians in Gaza. They're all Hamas. Everything they said, you know, if you remember, I was saying from day one it was a genocide. I said, how can it not be a genocide? If you give an order, no food, fuel, water, or electricity can be admitted to an area which is hermetically sealed. What's going to be the result? That was pretty straightforward. So, but then the argument was, well, they just said it in the heat of the moment. They were so traumatized, so shocked, so outraged that they started to make statements which they really didn't believe, and then they moderated. Well, now you look back and you see, actually, those statements were perfectly, indeed, they were eerily accurate. of exactly what Israel proceeded to do the next 2 years. That wasn't the heat of the moment. That was a very calm, sober reflection. Yes, October 7th was a crisis, but it was also an unprecedented opportunity. It was a godsend. We are not going to mow the lawn in Gaza anymore. We're going to take every blade of grass in Gaza, 2.3 million blades of grass in Gaza, half of whom are children, and we're going to extirpate. Extirpate is the fancy word for pull out by the roots. We are going to extirpate every blade of grass in Gaza. And that's what they still, as we speak, they still intend to do. The genocide, in my opinion, and here I think the UN report is incorrect. The genocide is not the goal. The genocide is the means. They are going to kill off as many people as possible, as many persons as possible, and they will pulverize as much of the infrastructure as is necessary to do two things: to quote unquote persuade the people of Gaza to leave, and to persuade, in quotation marks, the international community to open the border and allow them out. And the truth is, it is a moral dilemma. It is a moral dilemma, whether at this point the demand shouldn't be raised to open the border and let them leave. I think that's a tough question. I myself, my opinion is that I will wait to hear what the international humanitarian organizations say. If Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, if United Nations Relief and Works Agency, if Philippe Lazzarini, if the head of the UN's chief, human rights chief, if the World Food Program, if Doctors Without Borders, if the various humanitarian organizations, if they reach the conclusion, all right, let them go, and let Israel have its way, I would go along with it. But I'm not going to say it on my own. I'm not going to be so presumptuous as to say I care more about Gazan life than they do. They're on the ground. They've given their all. They've done their best. They're not better people than me. So until they make the decision that we're going to call for opening the border of Gaza, I won't. But it is a dilemma. So in my opinion, what Israel is doing is it's using genocidal means. Genocide is defined by the 1948 Genocide Convention. It's the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, racial, religious, or ethnic group. Yes, they want to destroy in whole, in part or in whole, the Gaza population, but as a means to drive it out, to empty out Gaza. This is not to say that given the opportunity, they would kill every Gazan. But there's no moral issue here. For the Israelis, and I say the Israelis, I'm not saying Netanyahu. I'm not saying Netanyahu, Smotrich, and Ben-Gvir. I'm saying the Israelis, for all of them, for everyone, except a few exceptions which can fit into your studio. For every Jewish Israeli, the people in Gaza are vermin. They're human refuse. They not only are ready, they're not only ready to exterminate them, they are gleeful. That's a fact. They're gleeful at the prospect of exterminating them. That's a hard thing to digest. It's a very hard thing to digest. I read the human rights reports. Go read the new one from the UN Commission of Inquiry, which is pretty skimpy. It's 72 pages. Others have been what's called the memorial that South Africa submitted to the International Court of Justice. It's reportedly 700 pages with 4,000 pages of documentation. It's very substantial. But even if you just read the skimpy one that was put out just now by the Commission of Inquiry, there are a large number of pages devoted to Israel's targeting the skull and chest of children. It's methodical. It's systematic. They even use the word targeting toddlers, Toddlers, targeting toddlers. So Israelis, not Mr. Netanyahu alone, and not him and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir alone, the whole of Israeli society. What's happening now in Gaza is not a state project. It's a national project, very different. It's a national project. They, of course, would relish the prospect of wiping out everyone in Gaza. If I don't know your part of the world, but in my part of the world, when you're a child, you're 8, 7, maybe 6 years old, we used to have magnifying glasses. And we would focus the rays of the sun with a magnifying glass to burn ants. And we were gleeful. We were gleeful as we saw the ants crumble. They would burn to ashes. That's Israel. A child, magnifying glass in hand, burning ants. But they recognize in the current world, that's a hard act to pull off. Whereas the ethnic cleansing will be acquiesced in and then forgotten.
You've mentioned, you paint a very grotesque and unfortunately real picture of what we've been seeing. Now,
well, that's what the human rights reports are saying. I'm not there. I'm not on the ground. But given the magnitude of documentation, I have no grounds to doubt what's being said, what's being described. By the way, it's one of the main sources of all the reports that Israel's committing genocide. You know, it's one of the main sources.
Israeli soldiers, yeah.
Israelis post on the web. It's what the Israeli. They call them now Israeli security forces. They don't say IDF anymore. What the Israeli security forces post on the web, they post it gleefully. They post the humiliation and degradation of women in Gaza gleefully. That's them. That's the Israelis. I remember there was the guy, he was on the UN Commission of Inquiry, I can't remember, from Australia, Chris Sabodi, something like that. And he said during one news conference, he said, Israel likes to call itself the most moral army in the world. He says, well, actually, it's one of the most criminal armies in the world. I think that's true.
Now the sliding into this grotesque atrocity, right? Now, even the word sliding is I mean, it's questionable, right? But obviously, Israel's been allowed to do this because it's been enabled by so many people. Probably starting with Joe Biden, starting with major media houses, reporters who are on the ground in Ashkelon in the early days of this assault on Gaza. When you think about this, and you spoke at length about Israeli society and how this is a national project, when you think about who else is complicit, how would you kind of quantify that? And how do you think, I mean, we now see that there's so much hypocrisy in the world, but sort of 2 years ago, would you have thought that the global leaders, who we know are very hypocritical, would have been able to sort of allow and sort of embrace this hypocrisy? So I don't know if it's willfully or just so nonchalantly, but they have embraced it, and that's what matters.
It's not nonchalant. I mean, that is an absurd description for anybody who wants to pretend that. They were sending weapons every day. Israel couldn't have done what it was doing without the weapons being supplied. And as you pointed out, there was huge public dissent. It was not. There is an argument to be made. I'm not saying it's certain. There is an argument to be made that Kamala Harris lost the election because of Gaza. There's evidence. I'm not saying it's definitive evidence, but there was a huge public reaction. It was not easy. At a certain point, President Biden was being called Genocide Joe, and he was not happy with that title. So it was a very conscious, willful decision by him, by Anthony Blinken, by Jake Sullivan. I would say the complicity began. There was the complicity at blocking any action by the UN. There was the complicity by supplying all the weapons. Israel couldn't have done anything for 5 hours without the US supplying weapons. 5 hours, 5 minutes without the US supplying the weapons. And the media complicity. The media complicity, to my thinking, the media complicity begins with a very simple fact. Anyone who described what was happening in Gaza as a war was complicit in the fabrication, the propaganda. There was no war in Gaza. There was never a war in Gaza. There may have been a sideshow with Hamas, but it wasn't physically possible for there to be a war. Israel in 2024, it was dropping more bombs in Gaza in less than a week, than the US has dropped in Afghanistan in a year. And on top of that, Gaza's tiny places compared to Afghanistan. No soldier entered Gaza or continued forward in Gaza until everything to the left and right and in front of them was obliterated. There was no possibility of resistance. We'll just take one example. The ceasefire that was negotiated in January 2025, Israel ended it March 18th, 2025. Hostilities began again. Between March 18th, 2025 and the end of August 2025. You know how many people in Gaza were killed? 12,000. That's the conservative estimate, 12,000. You know how many Israeli soldiers were killed? 50. That's a ratio of 1 to 240. Does 1 to 240 sound like a war? Or does it sound like an extermination? There's no war in Gaza. And that was, in my opinion, the critical distinction as to whether you were reporting what was happening in Gaza or whether you were just an instrument of Israeli propaganda. Every day, the New York Times referred to the, quote, Israel-Hamas war. That was their standard headline. Israel-Hamas war. There was no Israel-Hamas war. If you look at Piers Morgan, the first year, all he talked about, I believe Israel had a right to self-defense. I believe Israel had a right to self-defense, as if we were carrying out a war of self-defense. By the end of the first year, that was no longer tenable, given the magnitude of destruction and death. So what did Piers Morgan do? He adjusted his script, and he said, I believe Israel had the right to self-defense, but their response has been disproportionate. That became the new tagline. But the response was disproportionate. Under international law, do you know what disproportionate means? It means you're targeting a legitimate military site, let's say combatants in conflict or a munitions dump. You're attacking a legitimate military target, but you killed too many civilians. The target was legitimate, but the number of civilians you killed in the course of targeting a legitimate site, the number of civilians you killed was excessive, disproportionate. That's what the principle of disproportionality means. It means that the number of civilians you kill has to be proportionate to the value of the military site, S-I-T-E, the value of the military site. So let's say if you kill an ordinary soldier, then you're only allowed to kill one civilian in order to kill the soldier. That's proportionate. But if it's, say, a senior combatant, a captain, a lieutenant, then you're allowed to kill 5 civilians because the value of the military site was more. That's proportionate. But if you kill 10 civilians to quote unquote take out the military commander, that's disproportionate. Why do I go through this disquisition, this little exercise in the laws of wars, it's called, international humanitarian law? Because the principle of proportionality or disproportionality, it presumes you're targeting a military site. That the point of departure is you're targeting a military site, but the number of civilians you killed was excessive or disproportionate to the military site. Israel wasn't targeting military sites. It was targeting the civilian population. It's something totally different. It's not a war. It's a genocide. And a war and a genocide are two altogether different things. In a war, what's your goal? Your goal is to inflict a defeat on your enemy's military. That's the aim of a war. You want to inflict a military defeat. You may kill civilians in the process, and you may even intentionally kill civilians in the process. It's called terror bombing. But the ultimate goal is to inflict a military defeat. That's what a war is. That's not what's happening in Gaza. They're not trying to inflict a military defeat. Their intent, in whole or in part, to destroy the civilian population of Gaza. That's the goal. Now, I should say that's the means. The goal is to expel them. But it's not a war. If it's a war, why are you targeting children in the head and chest? If it's a war, why are you targeting medics? Why are you targeting hospitals? Why are you targeting journalists? Why are you targeting aid workers? Does that sound like a war? 90% of the Hamas militants who were killed, whatever the number is, nobody knows what the number is. Anybody who claims to know the number is full of it's not being serious. 90%, you know how they died? Not in battles. Let the viewers ask themselves a simple question. Can a single viewer name a single battle? Can a single viewer name a single battle? Can you name a single battle? There have been no battles in Gaza. It just hasn't happened. So, that to me was the litmus test of whether you were a propagandist or whether you were accurately reporting what was happening. It's whether or not you described it as a war or a genocide. That was the breakthrough of the South African delegation to the International Court of Justice. They were the first official body. Now everybody says genocide, but remember, South Africa, they submitted their statement December 29th, 2023. It was very early. And they were the first ones to try to break the mold of Israel-Hamas war. I said, no, it's not a war, it's a genocide. Issues like proportionality are totally irrelevant. Proportionality presumes you're targeting a military site, but you're not targeting military sites. And it took a long time for the international community to come around to the fact that this is not a war, this is a genocide. It's something very different. So in my opinion, anyone and everyone who described this as a war was complicit in the Israeli propaganda campaign.
Hitler, you probably didn't even hate the Jews. That was just the meth making you crazy, dog.
All of you, get back in the closet. You deserve a ass whooping. All of you, get back in the closet.
How
Go
much does it
yourself.
cost for fascism? How much do the taxpayers have to pay for a fascist country?
They're evil. They are activists doing evil. So treat them like the evil that they are.
The time to start is now, right? The time to plant a tree is 10 years ago, and the second best time is now. Strikes are the most effective way to stop profits, get demands, and force policy changes. If you can shut down profit, you can make any politician do anything.
It's time to stop pretending otherwise. It's time to be ruthless and time to afford them the same amount of grace that they give to their Palestinian victims, because they are only going to get more and more ruthless with their victims if you don't.
Mic check 1 2. Welcome to the stream. I was trying to find somebody. Can't find him. Oh well.
Welcome to
I'll start with headlines and then go into more specific stories.
Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Israelis are marking the second anniversary of Hamas's attack, which left 1,200 people dead, including more than 700 Israeli civilians and 79 foreign nationals. Memorial events are underway in kibbutzim in southern Israel, where people were killed or kidnapped. Meanwhile, large rallies are being held in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, calling for the release of the remaining hostages held in Gaza and a ceasefire. Over the past 2 years, Israel's indiscriminate war in Gaza has killed more than 67,000 Palestinians, including at least 20,000 children, though the figures are believed to be a vast undercount, with thousands of bodies trapped under the rubble. In Egypt, indirect talks between Israel and Hamas are underway for a second day on a U.S.-drafted 20-point Gaza ceasefire plan. This comes as Israel continues to attack Gaza, with at least 8 Palestinians killed since dawn today. They're among more than 100 people killed since President Trump last Friday called on Israel to halt the bombing campaign. Meanwhile, a new study by the Costs of War Project finds the Biden and Trump administrations provided at least $21.7 billion in military assistance to Israel over the past 2 years. Swedish activist Greta Thunberg was among at least 170 activists deported from Israel Monday after Israeli military forces last week raided and captured dozens of boats in the global Samud flotilla, which attempted to break Israel's siege and starvation campaign in Gaza. On Monday, Thunberg spoke to a cheering crowd as she arrived at an airport in Athens, Greece, confirming she and other flotilla activists faced abuse in Israeli custody. She also posted this message on her Instagram.
Do not let me and other volunteers on the flotilla be a distraction. And the global Samud flotilla is about solidarity with Palestinians, international solidarity. And what Israel did was mainly not to illegally abduct us in international waters and abuse us in prison, but it was that it stopped a humanitarian mission and violating international law by preventing humanitarian aid from entering Gaza, a population that are being systematically starved by Israel. And this is a blatant violation of international humanitarian and maritime law.
More than 340 flotilla activists have been deported from Israel as advocates continue to demand the release of over 100 others who remain in Israeli prison custody, including U.S. citizens. Meanwhile, another wave of humanitarian aid vessels is sailing toward Gaza. The new flotilla is made up of 11 ships with activists from 25 countries, including doctors carrying medicine and nutritional supplies. Lebanon's health ministry says Israeli airstrikes killed 2 people and injured another in southern Lebanon earlier today. They follow an Israeli strike on a car Monday that killed a man who lost his eyesight in Israel's pager attack last year, along with his wife, who was driving the car. According to the United Nations, Israel's military has killed at least 103 civilians in the 10 months since it agreed to a ceasefire with Hezbollah. Despite the declared truce, Israel's kept up near daily attacks. In the United States, 200 National Guard troops from Texas are heading to Chicago after a judge declined to block their deployment following 2 lawsuits filed by the city of Chicago, the state of Illinois, journalists and protesters. This is Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson.
I promise.
Just something on the last story. Israel just cannot be trusted to have any kind of a peace negotiation. They're a rogue state, and they're just going to keep up the violence. They're trying to start World War III, and they might get their wish if they are not stopped.
The city of Chicago will do everything in our power.
Like, if the United States does not intervene, the one country that can have the most effect on Israel, the rest of the world has to intervene against Israel and the United States. That would be a catastrophe. And meanwhile, we have fascism in full swing on our own soil.
To protect the constitutional rights of all Chicagoans. And this lawsuit is the latest demonstration of our commitment. Let me be absolutely clear. The president is not sending military troops to Chicago to keep us safe. We know this because Trump has a history of targeting Chicago.
This comes as the Trump administration is asking an appeals court for authorization to send troops from Texas and California to Oregon after a federal judge over the weekend blocked the deployment of National Guard troops. In Portland, an elderly couple protesting ICE on Saturday say they were knocked over by federal agents. Lori Ekman told the Oregonian, quote, "With no warning, the feds charged into us, knocked us down, and sprayed us. I was hit in the head with a projectile," unquote. Oregon Senator Jeff Merkley said, quote, "Trump's troops are deliberately attacking peaceful protesters to incite violence. The goal is to generate riots to justify the expansion of authoritarian measures and to strengthen the case for the troop deployments," Senator Merkley said. The U.S. government shutdown has entered its 7th day. Democratic lawmakers are holding to their demands that Republicans agree to extend health care subsidies from the Affordable Care Act and reverse cuts to Medicaid. President Trump, who's threatened mass firings of federal workers, blamed Democrats for the shutdown, saying, quote, "I call them Democrat layoffs. They're causing it," unquote. His comments came just days after he celebrated the shutdown as an unprecedented opportunity to carry out mass layoffs. On Monday, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries challenged Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson to a prime-time debate over the shutdown, which Johnson rejected. This is Jeffries.
Well, the White House has gone radio.
Yeah, they don't want to participate in your campaign advertisements, essentially, by doing political theater over crumbs.
Silent since the Oval Office meeting last Monday, and neither Leader Schumer or myself
An unserious
have heard
piece of shit.
a word from the administration about resolving this issue, making clear to us that the White House wanted to shut the government down, to continue the chaos that they've been inflicting on the American people since day one of this presidency.
The government of Eswatini confirmed Monday it's received a second deportation flight from the United States carrying 10 people who were...
I'm not crazy to think that he's, like, trying to do a Barack Obama impression, right? Like, it's his cadence.
Day one of this presidency.
The government of Eswatini confirmed Monday it's received a second deportation flight from the United States carrying 10 people who were...
Maybe I am crazy.
...are not nationals of the small southern African kingdom. This comes after the Trump administration previously sent 5 other deportees to Eswatini in July. Lawyers and human rights groups warn deportees sent by the U.S. have been held in solitary confinement and denied access to their lawyers. The Trump administration's
I never said it was a good Barack Obama impression.
also sent third country deportees to Ghana, Rwanda, and South Sudan. The head of the United Nations Agency for Refugees is warning countries not to abandon the post-World War II framework for humanitarian migration, including the 1951 Refugee Convention. Filippo Grandi made the remarks Monday as some European nations and the Trump administration seek to limit the right of refugees to request asylum.
I'm worried that the current debate in Europe, for example, and some current deportation practices, such as in the United States, address real challenges in manners not consistent with international law.
Syria has established its first parliament since longtime ruler Bashar al-Assad was overthrown 10 months ago, ending a 12-year war. Many Syrians welcome this as a step forward after more than 5 decades of dictatorship under the Assad family. But the process was also widely criticized as undemocratic because the public did not directly vote for the lawmakers. Local committees cast their ballots Sunday, while interim Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara will appoint at least a third of the 210-member assembly. Concerns about the underrepresentation of women and minority groups. Only 4% of members of the new Transitional Assembly are women. In related news, the Syrian army and the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces have reportedly reached a ceasefire deal in Aleppo. This comes after recent escalating tensions between the two groups and the killing of a member of the Syrian security forces in an SDF attack. The International Criminal Court's convicted a former Sudanese militia leader of war crimes and crimes against humanity for his role in mass executions, rapes, and torture in the Darfur region. Ali Mohammed Ali Abdulrahman, also known as Ali Kushaib, was a commander in the Janjaweed militia when the Darfur conflict erupted more than 20 years ago. Then President Omar al-Bashir's government responded to the rebel uprising with a scorched earth campaign of aerial bombings and gruesome raids across villages carried out by Janjaweed troops. Over the years, it's estimated up to 300,000 people have been killed in Darfur and over 2 million displaced. Al-Bashir has been charged by the ICC with crimes including genocide and remains in a military-run prison in Sudan. ICC presiding judge Joanna Corner explained Monday's verdict.
The chamber is convinced that the accused is guilty beyond reasonable doubt of the crimes with which he has been charged. Its verdicts are unanimous.
This marks the first time the ICC has convicted a suspect of war crimes in Darfur. Back in the United States, Paramount Skydance has acquired the right-wing digital media outlet The Free Press for $150 million and has installed its co-founder, Barry Weiss, as editor-in-chief of CBS News. Weiss will report directly to David Ellison, the CEO of Paramount. The Free Press is backed by prominent Silicon Valley venture capitalists, has been widely criticized for its commentary on Gaza, including an article titled The Gaza Famine Myth, which questioned famine conditions in the besieged territory caused by Israel's assault and blockade. A CBS correspondent told The Independent, quote, "The fact that we don't have money to pay journalists, but we have money to pay Barry Weiss between $100 and $200 million is indicative of what the Ellison's true goal here is, and it's not journalism," they said. The Supreme Court's rejected an appeal from convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell, who's currently serving a 20-year sentence for sex trafficking. Maxwell had attempted to get the Supreme Court to rule on whether her case was covered by a plea deal Epstein reached in 2008 when he pleaded guilty to prostitution offenses in Florida in exchange for federal prosecutors agreeing not to charge his co-conspirators. Meanwhile, President Trump was asked Monday about a possible pardon for Ghislaine Maxwell.
I don't know. I mean, I'd have to speak to the DOJ. I'll look at it. I have a lot of people who have asked me for pardons. I call him Puff Daddy has asked me for a pardon.
But she was convicted of child sex trafficking.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have to take a look at it. I have to ask DOJ.
Meanwhile, Adelita Grijalva, who just won a special election for a congressional seat from Arizona last month, has still not been sworn into Congress, despite arriving in Washington, D.C. last week. Last Friday, House Speaker Mike Johnson canceled previously scheduled votes for this week and is holding pro forma sessions with just a few minutes of business per day. Grijalva thinks it's because she's the deciding vote on a petition to release the Epstein files. Democratic Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez echoed her concerns, writing on X, quote, "The government is in full shutdown and the Republicans are refusing to call the House back into session. Want to know why? Because we have secured the final vote on releasing the Epstein files and they don't want them out," unquote. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by
Fucking A, dude. Insane.
a federal judge in Chicago.
Insane headlines, man. But the fascism on the ground in America, we'll get that covered, and we'll move on to Gaza.
Chicago has refused the Illinois Attorney General's request to immediately block the Trump administration from deploying hundreds of National Guard troops to the state, instead saying she'll hear arguments on Thursday. This is in contrast to Portland, Oregon, where a federal judge appointed by President Trump did issue a restraining order to stop Trump from sending troops. Illinois Governor Pritzker said Monday he would not back down.
Since the beginning of this invasion, families have been snatched up off the streets or removed from their homes, zip-tied and detained for hours, including especially U.S. citizens and legal residents of our state. And in the words of CBP Chief Patrol Agent Greg Bovino, they're being chosen by how they look.
Also on Monday, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson announced he'd signed an executive order to stop federal immigration agents from using certain city-owned spaces.
The order establishes ICE-free zones. That means that city property and unwilling private businesses will no longer serve as staging grounds for these raids.
This comes after an overnight ICE raid on a Chicago apartment complex days ago, when ICE agents wearing fatigues and carrying guns repelled from a Black Hawk helicopter and zip-tied children and U.S. citizens while carrying out arrests. A neighbor described the terrifying ordeal to ABC 7 Chicago.
They was terrified. The kids was crying. People was screaming. They looked very distraught. I was out there crying when I seen the little girl come around the corner because they was bringing the kids out too. Had them zip tied to each other. That's all I kept asking. Where's the morality? Where's the human? One of them literally laughed. He was standing right here. He said, them kids.
Meanwhile, Friday, federal agents handcuffed Chicago alderperson Jessie Fuentes and briefly detained her when she asked if they had a signed warrant for a man they were trying to detain at a hospital.
He has constitutional rights. Do you have a sign?
No, you need to leave. Turn around. Turn around and leave. He's under. I'm going to arrest you. You were going to be placed under arrest.
Do you have a constitutional warrant for him?
For those who can't see, the agent then pulled her hands behind her back and handcuffed her. The video was shared in a report by the news outlet.
What is an alderperson? It's not clear as some kind of religious figure.
Book Club Chicago, which is part of a coalition of Chicago journalists and activists who filed a new lawsuit with the ACLU of Illinois against the Trump administration over a pattern of, quote, extreme brutality, unquote, by federal agents during protests at the Broadview ICE detention center in a Chicago suburb. In this CBS News Chicago story, correspondent Azal Rezai describes how she was attacked while reporting at the ICE jail.
An ICE agent that was masked pointed his weapon and shot directly at my car. He saw my window was open, and he shot right here. You can see the point of impact right there.
You can see white powder exploded on the hood of her car, windshield, and even engulfed the inside.
And I was sitting right there with my window open. A lot of it went inside of my car and on my face. I immediately felt it burning. I started throwing up.
For more, we're joined by Ed Yanka, Director of Communications and Public Policy for the ACLU of Illinois. Ed, thanks so much for being with us. There's so much to discuss here. I mean, one lawsuit after another. Most recently, yesterday, the filing of the lawsuit around the deploying the federalized troops to Chicago. Apparently, Governor Abbott allowed the troops to go from Texas, and they're in Indiana right now. But talk about the judge's ruling and the other lawsuits as well that you're a part of.
Sure. So the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago, as you say, filed a lawsuit yesterday to challenge the federalization of National Guard and deploying them here for a very simple reason. There's no emergency and there's no justification for having guards or troops here in the city of Chicago or in the Chicagoland area. In fact, what we have seen over the last few weeks is the escalation of violence and chaos on behalf of ICE agents or conducted by ICE agents. Everything from, marching up and down in fatigues and pulling families out of parks, marching up and down Michigan Avenue, pulling families out of parks, to, as was described in our lawsuit yesterday with a coalition of legal organizations, taking on what we've seen is, just the indiscriminate firing of projectiles and chemical weapons at the Broadview Detention Center, and our processing center, which has become a detention center. So what we're seeing, and in the other clips you played, is just this escalation of violence. And when anybody protests, then that's seized upon by the administration as a claim for the need to bring in further forces. But further forces are just going to escalate tensions here. They're not going to make things better.
And Ed, could you talk about this remarkable raid that occurred last week at an apartment complex that the ICE were claiming that it was a hotbed for Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang? Can you talk about what actually happened there?
Yes, and Juan, you know how just incredible and remarkable this is as a Chicagoan. Last week, what we saw was in the middle of the night, hundreds of heavily armed ICE agents, masked up, attacked a single apartment building. Broke into that building, rappelled off of a Black Hawk helicopter to get to the roof of the building, then proceeded to go through the building and kick down every single door that they could, take whomever they found into custody, and then, as we know, release some of those people hours later because they either had no criminal background, they were green card holders, and in many cases, they were citizens, including zip-tying children out in the streets of Chicago, separating them from their families, and then hauling them away as well. This is just, and we have not yet to this hour heard any justification or rationalization for why it was that they needed this kind of overwhelming force. There's not been charges brought against anybody. There's been no explanation. There's been no production of a warrant in public to justify why an entire apartment building was attacked, even if there was.
They're just playing with their toys. They're like, shit, we got these Black Hawk helicopters. Do you think we could do a raid on some apartment building in Chicago? As like, I don't know, a show of force? Just boys with toys.
a person or set of people in the building that they wanted to try to detain. They didn't need to literally render 100 people unhoused because they've created a situation where they can't go back into the building.
And have there been any reports of who was actually detained or where the people are?
No, that's been very difficult to find out, Juan. In fact, our lawyers have spent the last several days trying to talk to people who lived in the building, trying to talk to neighbors and others around there.
Oh, so they disappeared people. America's Nazi brown shirts are rappelling from helicopters on American soil. Okay.
To see if we can find out where these people were taken to see what happened to them, to hear about their experiences firsthand.
Just so we're grasping the gravity of the fucking situation,
But the reporting on this is just awful.
Can you talk about the possibility of President Trump invoking the Insurrection Act and how rare this is?
It would be incredibly rare, Amy. As you know, the Insurrection Act has been used only a few times in our country's history, and the purposes of the Insurrection Act are in no way, shape, or form met in the city of Chicago. There is no invasion here. There is no armed conflict going on. There is no, sabotage to the actions of the federal government. And in fact, the courts and the government and everyone else is proceeding and operating in the normal fashion. Just to make the point, yesterday, government lawyers stood against state lawyers in a federal courthouse and in a federal courtroom to raised the question about whether or not National Guard was available. Police stopped people yesterday in the city of Chicago. ICE continued to make raids in the city of Chicago. There is nothing here that justifies something as extreme as declaring that there is an insurrection, which requires, troops and allowing troops to engage in practices that take them beyond just, quote unquote, providing protection for federal officials.
And could you talk, Ed, also about the response of local city officials? There was an extraordinary press conference by Police Superintendent Snelling yesterday where he said that some more than 20 Chicago police officers were actually hit with tear gas at Broadview, fired by ICE agents.
Actually, that was at a protest after a person was shot in the Brighton Park neighborhood on Saturday. CPD responded to that event because of the fact that there was shots fired. There was, people had gathered around. There were people protesting, decrying the fact that ICE had once again shot someone, as we saw here a couple of weeks ago in a traffic stop. And in this instance, the CPD showed up to try to assist with crowd control, with, clearing the traffic and allowing people to move on. And ICE, instead of letting CPD or any other official do their job, simply began to fire tear gas at the crowd. This is the same thing, by the way, we've seen in Broadview. Last weekend, the Illinois State Police set up a protection zone at Broadview and tried to sort of create at least some barrier between ICE agents and others. And again, rather than working with local police, ICE just continued to behave in the way that they have for the past few weeks, to go through the crowd when they wanted to try to push back the crowd. These are just these kind of bullying, goonish tactics that we're just seeing them do anywhere. And it doesn't matter if they're, if they're pushing back against protesters, against clergy members, against journalists, or against the police. They just seem to think that they have the power to act and behave in whatever way they want.
Ed, we were just showing video put out by the Department of Homeland Security as you were talking about the Black Hawk helicopter, ICE agents rappelling down from it, armed automatic weapons, the agents moving into apartments. They're putting it out because presumably they think this is good propaganda.
Oh, what's up, Pillow? Welcome. Yo, Brody, you support the LGBTQ community? Yeah, man. Because they're human beings. No, it's called being an ally. So you gay. You're Y-O-U-R, an ally with gay people. Can't get more gay than that. Good one, man. Anything else? Do you support guys chopping their meats off? Get fucked.
For them. Can you comment on this, the terror that these families felt with faces not being obscured?
Thanks, Amy, for giving me the chance to speak to this. And let me start by noting, They put out this propaganda reel before they ever explained what the actual rationale for the raid is. So the most important thing for them was to have HD video of what was happening, not to actually speak to why this happened. And what what you see in that video, and I think what you hear from members of the community is a complete terror, a sense of terror that their community, a working class black and brown community, is being targeted in this way by federal forces.
Uh-oh, what did the dumbass come in and say? He just came in and was like, I mean, you can look back in the VOD after the stream, but he was like, just being transphobic. It's the tags that I have, like LGBTQ. Some people, I think, actually like search them just to troll. So we had to click on an LGBTQI friendly space hashtag to come in and be like, do you support the LGBTQ community? Which is like, on its face, a dumb question, given that you just clicked on a tag that says LGBTQI friendly space. Just dumb people, you know. But I was like, yeah, I support the gay community. He's like, so you gay? I'm like, no, it's called being an ally. It's like, well, it doesn't get more gay than that. Well, see, that's the thing, like, you can't really interface with people who use terms like gay as a pejorative, because you're either talking to someone who is 14 or is 14 mentally, you know?
Forces using this kind of militarized force, and it is, it's caused.
But this footage, yeah, well, Logic and them aren't friendly. Yeah, exactly, Pillow. What the fuck is up with this sizzle reel that they made for ICE? It's like, this is what you're doing with all the money you have? You're like, not only can they do terror, they can turn it into a movie as well. Yeah. Like I said, I think people just troll tags, which is like a great use of your time.
Causing, panic and terror and fear all across the community for many. There are people who are not leaving their homes every day out of fear. There are children who are not going to school. Restaurants and cafes and stores in some of our neighborhoods are suffering economically as the result of this fact. And all of this is in service of a reckless policy that is not in any way, shape, or form making the city of Chicago or the Chicagoland area any more safe.
Thank you for being with us. Ed Yonke, ACLU of Illinois, Director of Communications. Thanks for watching Democracy Now! On YouTube. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to make sure you never miss a video. And for more of our...
Good morning. I'm Sharif Abdul Quddus with Dropsite News, dropsitenews.com. Today marks 2 years of genocide in Gaza, 2 years of the most violent episode in the modern history of Palestine. Israel has killed over 67,000 Palestinians, including over 20,000 children, and that number is a bare minimum. Thousands more are missing under the rubble. Thousands of deaths that we don't know about. There have been so many massacres, flower massacres, aid massacres, Red Crescent massacres, school massacres, the massacres of over 1,000 families and bloodlines that have been wiped.
We can safely assume around 700,000 people, Palestinians, have been killed, murdered by Israel. That's the figure.
Wiped out forever. We don't even know the number of deaths not caused by bombs or bullets or shells or drones, the number of preventable deaths caused by Israel's assault. We do know that at least 460 Palestinians, including 154 children, have starved to death, and more are dying every day from Israel's campaign of forced starvation and famine. Entire cities have been reduced to dust and broken concrete. Homes, hospitals, schools, universities, mosques, churches, bakeries, everything that knits a community and society together
You know, dust would be manageable. No, it's rubble. It's twisted metal and rebar and heaps of concrete, entombing people where they used to live. It will take until 2050, like Norm Finkelstein said at the beginning, because of all the unexploded ordnance, because of all the apparent asbestos that's everywhere. 25 years to clear all the rubble. And that's if we start today.
Has been destroyed. Even color seems to have been obliterated. Everything is now covered in gray dust. 92% of residential buildings have been damaged or destroyed. Over 500 schools and every university has been damaged or destroyed. Only 1.5% of cropland is still accessible and suitable for cultivation. Nearly every Palestinian in Gaza, 95%, has been displaced, most of them multiple times.
Sit with the ecological devastation for a moment. 1.5% of the land is usable for crops. That's like people's backyards, if they have a backyard left. Where is that tillable land? Is it just individual pots? What are we talking about here? It's a geographical, humanitarian, and ecological wasteland in Gaza. The equivalent of 8 nuclear bombs have landed on Gaza in conventional weapons. There's so much unexploded ordnance, the resistance is able to utilize them in combat operations. They're called return to sender operations. This is a Holocaust in its own right. But it's not quantified in numbers of deaths, of the numbers of people that Germans could fit onto trains. It's quantified in how many have starved to death, how many have been displaced, how many buildings have been destroyed, cultural landmarks, your universities. That's how we measure this Holocaust and the statements of the perpetrators. That's how we measure it. A Holocaust museum for the Palestinians would cover a time span of decades. More than half a century. Generations under oppression, generations wiped out under oppression.
Of thousands now live in 10 cities where they are still bombed and shelled and shot. The healthcare system has been devastated. Out of 38 hospitals in Gaza, 25 are completely shut down, while the rest are barely functioning. The number of doctors and medical personnel killed is over 1,700. Over 360 have been detained. Journalists have been slaughtered. Israel has killed between 250 and 270 journalists and media workers over the past 2 years, an unprecedented number. There's so much that is unprecedented. And of course,
Yo, I heard at least a minimum 300 journalists have been killed. What are these old-ass numbers he's got?
Israel's massive colonial violence is by no means confined just to Gaza. Over the past 2 years, we've seen a huge escalation in daily attacks and dispossession in the occupied West Bank by Israeli settlers and soldiers. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have been driven from their homes in the largest wave of displacement in the West Bank since 1967. The number of Palestinians arrested in the West Bank and Jerusalem over the past 2 years has topped 20,000, including over 1,600 children. At least 77 political prisoners have died in custody. And it's not just Palestine, of course. Israel has bombed Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Iran, Qatar. We could spend hours listing facts and figures, and it would still not come close to capturing what has been wrought. And it has ruptured not just Palestine and the region, but it has reverberated across the globe. And all of this has been backed and supported and armed by the United States more than any other country. A new report by the Cost of War Project at Brown University found that the US has provided Israel with at least $21 billion in military aid over the past 2 years alone. And it concludes with the obvious. Israel would not have been able to sustain its wars across the Middle East without this massive US backing. Today, we're going to talk about all of this and more, and we're fortunate to be joined by renowned Palestinian human rights lawyer, legal scholar Noura Arakat. Yesterday, she addressed the UN Security Council, only the second Palestinian woman to brief the Security Council since October 7th, 2023, and the first to present the legal case that Israel's war in Gaza is genocide. She spoke at the annual open debate on women, peace, and security. This is some of what she had.
Excellencies, you cannot allow brute power to unravel our humanity. I therefore urge you to insist that any solution to end the genocide not come at the expense of accountability or respect for international law. To ensure, as stipulated by the ICJ, that the end of occupation is overseen by the UN, not Israel and its allies. To protect the integrity of ongoing proceedings at the ICJ and the ICC. To end the transfer of arms and other equipment or items, including jet fuel, to Israel. To pursue prosecution of individuals, corporations, and media companies complicit in genocide. And to ensure that Palestinian women can meaningfully participate in rebuilding their societies and ultimately forging our collective futures. Should you be paralyzed by fear, I encourage you to look to Palestinian women. They refuse to surrender. Neither should you. Thank you.
Was Palestinian human rights lawyer and legal scholar Noura Arakat addressing the UN Security Council yesterday. Noura joins us now live. She's a professor at Rutgers University and the author of Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. Noura, welcome to Dropsite's live stream. Let's begin. Can you just take stock of where we are today, 2 years into this genocide? What do you think is most important for people to understand and take in today?
Thank you, Sharif, and thank you to the Dropsite team. It's been really wonderful to see you create, a vehicle and an infrastructure in order to keep us informed, to report with integrity at a time when we've seen our journalistic core almost, implode and fall out the bottom in its protection of genocide and its protection of, a racist colonial ideology that it refuses to touch. And so it's been really refreshing that we are reminded that if it does not exist, we create it. I think, and that touches on where we're at this moment. I think that the primary takeaway.
You've heard of leftist audio, but have you heard of leftist video?
Is that after 2 years, right, and the register of death and destruction that you narrate.
I think we just lost Noura. We had a little bit of a problem with her connection. We're going to bring her back.
Listen. If someone freezes like that and you're still getting audio, you are on borrowed time, my friend. You're going to lose connection. It's just a matter of when. So when you inevitably lose connection, try not to look so surprised.
Destruction that you narrate.
No way. Lost connection?
We just lost Noura. We had a little bit of a problem with her connection. We're going to bring her back in a moment as she reconnects. Again, today marks 2 years since the genocide began, and Noura is coming back right now. Hi, Nora.
Sorry about that. I know that I was connected, so I apologize. But I was just saying that after 2 years of this register of death and destruction, there's an attempt in order to push this revisionist history to make this out to be a really severe hostage crisis that revolves around Israel. I mean, that's literally where we're at. That after we have seen, what I think we didn't expect, because there have been the taking of captives, of Israeli captives, and not necessarily civilian hostages, but of Israeli soldier captives previously by Palestinian groups, and including Hamas. And in those instances, there that has led to negotiations in some strange way that was treated as prisoners of war, obviously not by Israel, but if you graft onto it the laws of war, these are POWs, they're exchanging them, and so on and so forth. In this episode of what happens after October 7th, I think it represented, a few things, miscalculations that we couldn't have anticipated. I don't think that it was apparent to anybody how little Palestinian life cost or meant or was worthy. I mean, the extent and the ease with which we've been killed with zero consequence is astounding. It's gutting, really. The other thing that we didn't anticipate is that even beyond that, racist dehumanization, is that there are rail guards that even if we're moving towards the point where the logic amongst political and economic elite is, kill them all, which is really, it has been the attitude. They're telling us openly, like, too bad for those Palestinian kids, but we can't let them grow up because they might resist and fight for their freedom. Right? That there are norms, there are principles, right? Both in international law, certainly, but also principles across, in reference to academic freedom, in the freedom of speech, in the right to protest, in democratic representation, in journalistic, representation. And we have seen literally almost all of these industries and these principles, just collapse for the sake of allowing Israel to finish the job, to continue its Nakba as it wants. And so much attention is looking to international law and how it's failed, which I would completely echo.
To continue its Nakba. Well said.
I have things to say about the Security Council, but I just want to emphasize that it's not just like these legal institutions that we've seen become really impotent, incapacitated, right, by U.S. threats and otherwise, but universities, even before the Trump administration had assumed the presidency, on their own, were attacking their students and punishing their professors and firing their tenured professors, right? There were snipers at the top of universities before there was a Trump administration threatening their funding. Reflects for us, right? What is the structure of university governance? That now, academic freedom is not the central principle, but instead whoever serves on these trustees and these boards have become increasingly representative CEOs of weapons manufacturers who are profiting, have become hedge fund, managers, venture capitalists, and otherwise, who have a tremendous amount of wealth and are also reflecting their financial interests. We have seen these boards, members of these boards donate the Canary Mission to dox their own students. I mean, in journalism, you can tell us the story, Sharif. We just saw you again on Al Jazeera reporting on the direct targeting of journalists, and yet the impotence of a journalist, a journalistic corps to even stand up and defend the life of their journalists. We've seen the same in the medical industry. Like, the medicine is meant to, with an oath to do no harm, and yet you've seen medical associations writ large, with few exceptions, endorse genocide through complicity. And the same can be said, right, about what was I was rattling off journalism, academia, medicine, law. The same can be said about our political structures. Even the right to protest, right, and freedom of speech is blatantly gutted. We hear, a British, parliamentarian yesterday say, you've done too much protesting. Just because you have freedom doesn't mean you need to exercise it every day. I mean, this is where we've gotten to. Nobody could have anticipated, I certainly could not have anticipated, a suicide pact across industry and field, ready to destroy itself for the sake of enabling Israel to finish the job of Nakba, to remove. They do not have to answer for their crimes at all, and no longer have to deal with the fact of their crimes that are necessary to sustain a Zionist project. I mean, Zionism is, the establishment of a Jewish majority state on a land where Palestinian people seek to achieve their self-determination and to be self-determined. The only way Israel has been able to achieve that is through criminality, through prolonged military occupation, through apartheid, through genocide. And rather than attack these systems, right, Palestinians are attacked. If you get rid of Palestinians, Israel isn't any longer an apartheid regime because they're gone, right? And there seems to be a suicide pact, unfortunately, from us that signed off on this. And the upside of this is, wow, the resilience of civil society to fill in the void and to name this. But I think what's looming ahead of us is, what does this mean for Palestinians, certainly, but what does it mean for the rest of us?
I mean, there's certainly, yes, in almost every institution, cultural institutions, professional institutions, academic institutions, there seems to be this massive struggle between elites and leadership and the rank and file over Palestine that has brought these issues really to the fore in a way that we haven't seen in a generation. And you mentioned international law and the Security Council. I do want to hear what you have to say. I mean, you obviously felt it was important to address the Security Council. You're a legal scholar, international human rights lawyer. We all know, people keep speaking about this post-Cold War order being crumbled now and being destroyed. This order kind of always was built and served the powerful, but it was used by people like you in different ways. But can you speak to like what this architecture means, what the UN means, what the Security Council means, what international law means anymore in a moment when the most powerful countries in the world are backing and justifying genocide?
So I'm going to just start from the moment of why I address the Security Council, despite all my cynicism and analysis of international law as a site of colonial oppression and so on and so forth. So I will say this, that as a legal scholar and an advocate, I understand very well that the Security Council is the most significant body in terms of this international architecture that we have. The Security Council is the sole source of enforcement authority enshrined under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which affords to the Security Council, comprised of 5 permanent member states and its 10 rotating members, the authority to declare peace, to declare when there's been a breach of that requires, that justifies self-defense, that affords to them the authority to impose sanctions, embargo, communicate on communication, diplomacy, trade, and affords to them most significantly the right to mobilize collective force. Right. This is the only. So when you think about international law, that it's only words. The reason people say that is because law needs to be enforced. And in most domestic situations, we understand that if in the United States, let's say, for example, if the legislature, the Congress makes the law, the judiciary interprets the law, and then the executive branch enforces the law through its monopoly on state violence. Right. And so that's what law enforcement is and the rest of it. And that doesn't exist. We have a legislative body in the international system. It is the UN General Assembly. We have a judicial system, a judiciary in the international system.
But where are they? What have they done? Except allow the United States to veto every single attempt at peace.
Comprised of many, many courts, but most notably the International Court of Justice, which is the primary organ of the UN, as well as the International Criminal Court, which has been created by treaty, as well as many regional courts and so on and so forth. And ad hoc tribunals as well, but we do not have enforcement authority, right? NATO is not a global police. There is no global police. The closest thing that we have to that enforcement authority is the Security Council, as enshrined in Chapter 7. Theoretically, it's the most significant, and addressing it is quite a big deal. And I wanted the opportunity. I knew that I would be the first, Palestinian American woman to be making the case for genocide, and to do it with an emphasis on the intensity of attack on Palestinian women and girls in particular, that targets our reproductive capacity, systematically, so that the way that Palestinian women have been attacked and have not been able to conceive, not been able to carry to full gestation, have not been able to deliver, have not been able to have their babies survive, right, is systematic as part of an effort to obliterate the possibility of a Palestinian future, which is genocide. It dissatisfies 3 of the 6 specific acts in the Genocide Convention. And for Palestinians, this is emblematic of the ongoing Nakba. And to make that case and to insist this is not just like the tragic outcome of a really gory war, but that this was the intent all along. And what was really disappointing, was, and then obviously I took the opportunity to take aim at the Trump-Netanyahu plan, which we can talk about as well. But what's really disappointing is that what I found in the Security Council, that they also don't see sources of power. Everybody after that, we sat there for 3 hours listening to the statements, with the exception of the United States, right, whose deputy permanent representative amended her comments to come at me and say that any, genocide, my accusation of genocide is anti-Semitic and that I've disparaged their wonderful peace plan, right? With the exception of her, everybody just read their prepared statements, and all their statements repeated, we need actions, not words, which is the most ironic thing to say in the Security Council, which is the source of action. And so it was emblematic of, wow, we're it. They are not going to do it for us. And so, here we are.
It's what launches flotillas.
This is what the response by Ambassador Dorothy Shea, the Deputy U.S. Representative to the UN, she said yesterday in response to you, I must address allegations of genocide made in this debate. These accusations are categorically false and fuel anti-Semitic hatred and violence around the world. America fully supports Israel's right to defend itself. And then it goes on and on. The loss of civilian life in Gaza is tragic, but the responsibility for this conflict rests with Hamas, which could have stopped the fighting long ago by freeing the hostages and agreeing to the ceasefire terms accepted by Israel. I do want to ask you about these latest ceasefire terms and what you think.
Sharif?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. For some reason it cut out. I don't know what happened.
Oh, okay. Yes, well, I remember actually in October of 2023, just a couple of weeks into the war, we were at a lunch with a few friends, and you were explaining to some people why this is genocide. And this was just a couple of weeks into the beginning, why this meets the legal definition of genocide. Many Palestinians were saying this at the time. The rest of the world has very slowly caught up, and we saw groups like Amnesty International, Israeli groups like B'Tselem, the UN, finally
Bernie
Sanders, Association of Legal Scholars, and it's almost coming to be generally accepted that this is genocide, and yet it's still being allowed to happen. We're seeing now, and I don't know if that's linked, but we're seeing now, yes, some sort of push for a ceasefire. It is the plan put forward by Trump and his team is essentially a plan of surrender to Hamas. It's a pretty bad deal that they have to basically hand over all of their captives on faith that Palestinian captives will be released and that the genocide won't just resume again. And then there's all this talk of Tony Blair overseeing Gaza and different things.
Zero irony.
What do you make of this proposal and what's happening right now? Of course, we want the bombs to stop, and it seems to be the only way. But Hamas seems to have given a way of threading the needle in its response, but it's a very precarious situation. So, what do you think is happening right now?
I want to address first this thing about genocide. I know for my Palestinian siblings, this is so frustrating because we have a name for it. It's Nakba. And it's ongoing, what do you call it, and making that the primary argument. It's like almost a distraction. My goodness, call it what you want. And the only thing I will say in response to that why that still, despite my deep frustrations, why that still unfortunately remains relevant is because this is literally about the legitimacy of Israel's attack on Palestinians in Gaza, right? If this is a war, right, then it features, nobody's in denial. Even the apologists for Israel who deny there's genocide will admit that it features war crimes and crimes against humanity, but ultimately want to defend the legitimacy of the campaign. Genocide indicates that it is not a legitimate campaign because whereas in warfare, the military goals are legitimate to achieve as long as they meet laws of war and prohibitions in international criminal law that protect civilians, that those military goals are legitimate. But those of us who have insisted that it's genocide, we're saying that the goal of the campaign is the destruction of the Palestinian people, which is never legitimate. Hence, everything else is covered, right? The destruction of Hamas is covered. The retrieval of the hostages is covered because were those, in fact, the actual goals, there were other ways to achieve that far earlier, especially given that Hamas by October 10th, 2023 said, take back all the civilians. We want to keep the military captives because that, but take back the civilians. This wasn't, and they refused. And so the purpose here has been the destruction of the Palestinian people, specifically in order, when they say they want to destroy Hamas, they want to destroy in Palestinians the audacity to resist in any way. And the only way to destroy that is to destroy Palestinians, to remove them. So that's why that becomes, so relevant. For Palestinians, for those, we've been studying this. We see it, we live it, because we understand Nakba, we understand genocide, because we understand settler colonialism, we understand native elimination. And it was, easier for us quickly. I mean, you can immediately, and I've been, I went to Gaza in the aftermath of the first large-scale onslaught in 2008, 2009, so early in February 2009, with a legal delegation to investigate war crimes. And so I've been looking at this closely throughout the systematic war. And so knowing full well what was about to come and how Israel had changed the laws of war in the course of these attacks, and all of the talking points that they had, we already knew what they were. So that's how we could respond, and we're able to say that in a way where those who were removed, who weren't paying attention to Palestine, are first and foremost taken by what Hamas did, the attacks on October 7th, and that becomes their primary compass. That becomes the beginning of history. Gaza has no geography. It floats outside of Palestine. It floats outside of the Middle East. Period. Right? Hamas has no history. All of a sudden, and even the sympathetic at the top wanted to insist, as they did with me on many interviews, can you come onto the program and explain why all Palestinians are not Hamas? And I would refuse and say that's a very racist line of questioning. Let's say all Palestinians supported Hamas. How does their support change their civilian status to make them into legitimate targets? Right? And so there was just this emphasis of somehow the refusal to even engage. Like, who's Hamas? When are they founded? What is that? And so I think that has been the primary frustration. Look how far we've gotten anyway. I mean, of course, I say the we, but it's Palestinians that have been samadu, who have been so steadfast, because they have been so steadfast and suffered something that no one should suffer. No mother, father, no parent should suffer the loss of their children in the systematic slaughter. That now, it's illuminating, propaganda wasn't enough, and now repression isn't even enough. So now we're at the point where they've presented this proposal that's full of illegalities, Sharif. It's full of, all of it is illegal, all of its terms, aside from the vagueness. But the part that stands out so starkly for me is the way that it whitewashes genocide. It's as if that hasn't happened. There's no accountability for Israel. Only Hamas, right? Hamas has the imperative to demilitarize and to step down from power. There's no accountability for Israeli individuals who incited genocide, who orchestrated genocide. There's no accountability for any of the weapons manufacturers that provided the technology in order to, deliberately target Palestinians. There's no accountability for the media corporations who incited genocide and repeated lies. There's no accountability for heads of state like Biden, who repeated the lie that he saw 40 beheaded babies twice that never exist in pictures that never existed. There's no accountability, period. And that part, what they're trying to do is to rehabilitate and save Israel in this moment in a way that is full of illegalities and that will set us up in what you call surrender, what becomes a permanent occupation that is even more severe than preceding October 7th, because it explicitly bifurcates Gaza from the West Bank. It's not a holistic whole. It will not be governed by Palestinians at all. The right to self-determination doesn't exist. Even the mention of Palestinians to stay in Gaza, right? That's kind of what the Arab states supported and wanted to see. They're not even referred to as Palestinians. Gazans will be able to stay in Gaza and live a good life. Those are Palestinians staying in Palestine. And that, for those, I guess if we're going to get into the legal part of it, the vagueness of language here, read through, a legal eye, aside from the illegality, right? Because all of this is, there are preemptory norms of self-determination, for example, that should be heeded, that are not here, and so on and so forth. But the UN is supposed to oversee the end of occupation, not Israel and its allies. Aside from the illegalities, just looking at the terms of it, and you allude to this, the lack of specificity is deliberate. It was the same lack of specificity in 1967 around Security Council Resolution 242 in the line that stipulated that Israel will withdraw from territories recently occupied. It was the lack of the definite article "the" or all the preceding all of the occupied, all of the territories recently occupied. Israel has used that loophole since 67 to basically say that as long as it withdrew a little, it's fulfilled the Security Council resolution, right? They withdrew from the Sinai, which is such a vast land that they say that it exceeds the Gaza and the West Bank, and therefore fulfilled their obligation and can stay in the Golan Heights in Gaza and the West Bank, right? But in Oslo, we see the same thing. It was the lack of specificity. It was the tabling of the 5 permanent, permanent status issues of settlements, Jerusalem, refugees, borders, and what? Forget the. Did I say Jerusalem?
Jerusalem,
refugees, settlements and settlers, borders. Let me leave it at 4 for now. Yeah. Suffice, that those are left off the table. That lack of specificity is precisely why the outcome that we have now, somewhat 32 years after Oslo, is precisely what Oslo had stipulated. It's not despite Oslo, it's because of Oslo. And so here we have another agreement that's setting us up for another God knows how many decades of violations and law and atrocity against Palestinians that will not remain stable, right? But that ultimately saves Israel at this moment of reckoning and allows them to continue this harm, this systematic violations with impunity. That's where we're at. And the worst part, I agree, Hamas did thread the needle. They had to, because even the General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, endorsed this plan. The Arab and Muslim states endorsed this plan. Yesterday at the Security Council, it was celebrated, right? I understand everybody wants the end to the genocide. Palestinians more than anyone, they need to eat and sleep. But it's coming, it's almost surrender, because they're basically saying we have no other power to do it any other way besides the way that the U.S. is dictating. U.S. and Israel are dictating, even if it sets up this horizon. And so the message that I have is that the worst thing that can happen after now is for us to relent. Already the EU has suspended its talks over sanctions on Israel in light of the plan. Right now, all attempts at accountability will be framed as undermining peace. We can't impose sanctions on Israel because that might undermine the peace plan. We can't prosecute war criminals. That might undermine peace plan. We can't continue at the ICJ. We can't continue at the ICC. And we have to make that impossible by not relenting.
I just have a couple more questions before we wrap up. But there's so much to talk about. I think when you were describing that this is Nakba, there was also, when you're talking about also the crackdown on academic freedom, we saw your colleague, Rabia Akhbariya, a human rights lawyer, put forward a paper and an idea of moving towards Nakba as a legal concept. That was then, I believe, the board of directors at Columbia Law Review didn't want it printed, and the Harvard Law Review also refused to print something like that, to try and have Nakba.
If I remember, it was Harvard first. It was Harvard first and Columbia. Yeah, right. Yeah.
But this idea that this is something that is actually different. It's a different method of oppression, repression, colonialism, all kind of wrapped in this way that we have decades of kind of evidence of. But you spoke recently in an event organized by the Hague Group in New York at the Ethical Culture Society, and you spoke about Zionism is a racist ideology, but that's not all it is. It's a colonial ideology, and you link that also to apartheid as a racist ideology, but also important to understand apartheid in South Africa was also a colonial ideology. Can you explain some of that and why what we need is decolonization and what that means?
Yeah, no, this is it. So just for folks to understand, this on November 10th, 2025, it will mark 50 years since Resolution 33 passed by the General Assembly that declared Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. And this resolution was come of really the third world in revolt that was amending a decade against racism that was targeting the apartheid regime in South and Southwest Africa. And what Palestinians did, led by Fayez Tayyeh, right, are, a Palestinian jurist, not the only, but one of the most significant, who is the PLO research director, becomes the first PLO research director and, first publishes this pamphlet in 1965 on Zionist colonialism in Palestine, providing racial and colonial theory, or racial and settler colonial theory, right, where he says, whereas, most European colonial regimes seek to dominate, the Zionist colonial regime seeks to eliminate, right? And so we get, even though settler colonialism doesn't come into full view in kind of academic fashion, so to speak, until the early 2000s, Fayez Tayyeh was saying this in 65. In 75, the PLO really wanted to unseat Israel from the General Assembly, just as South Africa had been unseated by revoking its membership credentials in 1974. But because Egypt wanted to recoup the Sinai Peninsula through bilateral negotiations with Israel overseen by the United States, Egypt blocked the move, finding that it might really upset the U.S. and undermine their negotiation. And so instead, the PLO, together with the Third World leadership, including Somalia, who makes this amendment in the third committee, present an amendment to edit the Decade Against Racism, condemning Zionism as a form of racism and racial colonialism alongside apartheid, alien occupation, colonialism, racism as such. And it was a hard-fought victory. It was a hard-fought victory, and one that the PLO itself rescinds in 1991 as a precondition for entering Oslo, right? Which is how we then get Oslo to insulate Israel from this critique where we can't reach the core. We can't reach the ideology that insists on genocidal expansion and territorial consolidation. And instead, we end up talking about peacemaking, dialogue, getting along, right? You've dropped power out the bottom, you've dropped structure out the bottom, and now all we have to do is how do Palestinians and Israelis get along? And both sides need to compromise, right? And so, but 30 years of struggle and 32 years of Israel sabotaging the possibility of a Palestinian state, and 30 years of Palestinian struggle, who by 2000 at the Durban Review Conference brought back Zionism as racism, right? Which is why the U.S. and Israel boycott the event in 2000. And then we see the culmination of this in 2021 in the Unity Intifada and the Declaration of Dignity and Hope by Palestinians that declare Palestinians are a singular people, Zionism is our singular enemy. And so we see this rehabilitation, and we're now in 2021 at a crossroads where you've got these institutions that have declared Israel an apartheid regime. You have the Unity Intifada, which has made it clear Palestinians are clear on this demand. We are at a fork in the road. We are either going to normalize apartheid or we're going to dismantle this regime. And Abraham Accords, normalization of apartheid, and now genocide, which is an outcome of that. I insist on the colonial dimension of this because unfortunately, I think that there's a misunderstanding of apartheid as really, really bad racism. When, apartheid is enforced most, that was referred to by the, South African Communist Party as a peculiar kind of colonialism. And understood, and part of the critique of the ANC, right, the African National Congress, led by Nelson Mandela, today remains in leadership. The critique that remains of the ANC is that in negotiating peace, and the first elections, multiracial elections, so to speak, is that they dropped colonialism from the demand and instead democratized the settler colony, but without redistributing everything that the settlers had stolen. So that 7% of the population, which identifies as white, owns almost 70% of all the land. And that's to say nothing of industry. Across all indicators in South Africa today, inequality between black and white is so severe. The bank ranks South Africa as the most unequal place on earth because of this lack of distribution. I mean, I think Ramaphosa, South African president today, Cyril Ramaphosa, now we see an attempt, to do some of that, which Elon Musk and the Trump administration referred to as white genocide. And then they offered refuge for 50 Afrikaners, self-identified, in the United States. But if you don't address the colonial dimension, this is what you get. You get a democratization of the settler colony without a redress of this original wrong. And so what does it mean to decolonize? Is redistribution, is repatriation, is return, is a dismantlement of obviously of the law, but also of the colonial institutions that continue to further, right, a regime of racial supremacy and theft. And so, I think we're at a point where we all need to develop a better vocabulary and grammar and discourse to be able to talk about this, to get out of this trap that we're in. And, much love and respect to all my comrades, but I think that the reliance has been on, those who study it. Like, you don't need experts to understand that an ideology is racist and colonialist, right? It's the same. We understand white supremacy as such. We understand apartheid as such, and so I think that it's imperative on us now to move forward. And this is the horizon now. On the ground, we haven't been able to affect the change that we want on the ground. But obviously, from all the polling that we've seen, we've changed discourse and public opinion. And I think that we can succeed in doing the work of delegitimizing this ideology, which we must. There's no room for any ideology that preaches a superior racial class under whatever auspices, freedom, liberation, right, you earned it, you're chosen, you're richer than other people, whatever it is. We're smarter, we have more weapons, whatever it is. There's just no room for it. And so, putting Zionism alongside, it's not the only one, but it's the one, I think I read this somewhere, it was really poignant, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the author, but she Zionism becomes the ideological cover for a more repressive regime, whether it's used cynically or sincerely, but it becomes the ideological cover. So if you can't discuss Zionism, you won't be able to combat all these other systems that you care about, because Zionism is used as the front, because you can accuse those who attack it of being bigoted against Jews. That's going to be far more effective than using other ideologies that have been delegitimized. And so it's imperative on us to develop that language and discourse, not to self-promote. I would I recommend reading Kaya Sayev's 1965 kind of book pamphlet. I also recommend Lana Tatur and Ronit Lenton's new anthology from Stanford on race and Palestine. I want to recommend that in terms of Daryl Lee, John Reynolds, and I have an article, an Angel, where we summarize this in really few words, 3,000 maybe. And then John Reynolds and I are now we finished a book on this that we hope will help people develop a language and be able to do this work, and so that they can study. And that book should be coming out with Haymarket.
Just last question before we wrap up. We are seeing this incredibly violent moment where it could be this other moment of post 1967 where things are really redrawn. Israel has taken land in Syria. The Syrian regime has fallen, a terrible regime, but one now that has been replaced with a much more compliant one in terms of resistance to Israel. Hezbollah has been severely weakened. Yemen is being bombed. There's there has been, and Gaza has been all but erased. We see what's happening in the occupied West Bank. We see this very violent expansion happening and annexation, and it's continuing, and the answer to any problem by Israel is just war. But at the same time, I haven't seen this level of support for Palestine in my life. I remember covering the second Nakba. You couldn't say Palestine. Saying Palestine was controversial. Like, that's not a country. You would get attacked so viciously for anything. You were, and that we had that acronym PEP, Progressive Except for Palestine. That was kind of like the norm. Now we're seeing this, this groundswell of opposition to Israel, a groundswell of solidarity with Palestine, massive marches, massive demonstrations, thousands of actors and media industry figures in Hollywood have signed a letter pledging not to work with Israeli state or anything linked to the Israeli state, which is incredible. We saw massive campus uprisings. We've seen people block ports. And so I guess my question is, do you have hope that there's actually, some argue that this is the end of Zionism as like a Pape, and it's just a very violent and very long end, and it's very hard to predict or tell anything, but I guess, yes, with all this darkness, there is this light also that's happening. And yeah, how would you kind of gauge this moment as we're entering kind of this third year of genocide?
I don't know if it's the end of Zionism, but it's the end of Zionism as we used to know it, which was equated with anti-Semitism. Not so much anymore. They're now the new Nazis.
I get so emotional. It is our duty to have hope. It is our duty to resist. It is our duty to fight. There is no alternative. There is no alternative. Even if you believe in your heart and justice but feel hopeless so you don't do anything anymore, what's the point of the protest? What's the point of writing a letter? What's the point of this meeting? What's the point of publishing? You're basically stopping, right? And the truth is that we are the most hopeful when we're doing the most work together. And we are the least hopeful when nothing is being done. So understand that your work and labor is the source of hope. It's like this dialectic. You want hope, but you're the source of hope. So you just gotta, this is the thing. And I get emotional because I think I had a really hard time, especially this year. I mean, all of us go through ups and downs, through rage and despair and like feeling like, I think I had the hardest time around when Israel attacked Iran. And I just saw everybody, even the Dems, who for them Obama is a darling, and negotiated civilian nuclear power for Iran, the nuclear agreement with them, U.S.-Iran agreement, that even Obama, allies, I don't know what you call them, were creating a discourse around Iran as a nuclear threat. And I was like, wait a minute, just pull up your darlings, documents. What are you talking about? And then seeing them totally rehabilitate Israel into a normal actor, even as it was, practicing aggression against, 5 different countries and committing a genocide, that was my lowest point. And the way that I have since then been able to pull myself out of despair was to remind myself, kind of what you were saying at the top, right? We couldn't say Palestine in early 2000, and look at us now, right? And I went farther than that. We have ancestors that have been doing this work for over 100 years, who in their moment of this deep despair possibly could not imagine that there would be an entire generation and millions across the world in protest. And here we are. And so I remind myself, I am a blip. I am a blip in the lineage of my ancestors and in the lineage of those who will be descendants, right? This continue. We continue. So this idea is that the end of Zionism is that not, I think we're right to be cynical, to see the Arab world, completely reconfigured. And you mentioned Syria, but it's not, yes, Syria because of its governance, its current governance, but wants to disarm, there's a faction in the Lebanese government that wants to forcibly disarm Hezbollah and enter into normalization with Israel. These states and people, it's not just the states, people are exhausted and don't know how to war and create and to pursue life, and are now entering into this phase where let's give normalization with Israel a chance. So it is as dismal as it is as hopeful, and I think that we need to hold those things in tension. It's not one or the other. These are happening at the same time. And right now, all the gains that we have to protect, because this plan in place is meant to rehabilitate Israel and to tell all those artists that took their music off Spotify and all those artists that refused, to perform, and all those, universities said, okay, go back to normal, everybody. We're back on track, and you can't make Israel into an enemy. It's a peace partner, and we can't do that. Let them do what they want. Do not take your foot off the brake. Israel has not stopped being an apartheid regime. Israel has not been held to account for genocide. The work is not done, regardless of what our political and economic elite insist upon.
Well, Noor Arakat, thank you so much. Thank you for all your work, such important work, and your words and your actions. And
particularly from the next.
Hello and welcome to MEE Live.
I'm Tamara Himani.
And I'm Matilda Manson. It's Tuesday, the 7th of October. Today we mark the 2-year anniversary of Hamas's attack and the outbreak of Israel's war on Gaza.
Two years of Israel's genocide in Gaza. Since the Hamas-led attacks on Israel on October 7th, 2023, that killed at least 1,200 Israelis, Israel has responded with a relentless assault on the Gaza Strip, one of the deadliest bombing campaigns in modern history. Human rights groups, international law experts, and politicians have called out Israel's actions as a systematic assault on Palestinian life and infrastructure in Gaza, amounting to the crime of genocide, with the intent made clear from the start. Israel's attacks have killed over 67,000 people, almost 20,000 of whom have been young children, and an additional 169,000 people have been severely wounded or maimed for life. Thousands more Palestinians are missing or presumed to be buried under the rubble. 460 Palestinians have died due to malnutrition and hunger, including 154 children, and over 250 journalists have been killed by Israel, making it one of the deadliest conflicts for journalists in history. Israel has forcibly displaced at least 90% of Gaza's 2 million population, and Israel continues to say that it wants to occupy more of Gaza, which experts have called clear ethnic cleansing. Most of the public services and infrastructure in Gaza have been destroyed by Israel, reducing people's daily activities to basic survival tasks. Attacks on hospitals have decimated Gaza's healthcare system as it struggles to cope with constant mass casualty incidents. Attacks on schools have deprived an entire generation of proper education, and attacks on offices and workplaces have left much of the population without employment or sufficient incomes. Israel has targeted food and aid organizations, creating an intentional food crisis and famine, where many households have reported going days without food. A staggering scale of death, destruction, and displacement, and an entirely man-made humanitarian crisis.
On the 7th of October 2023, nearly 1,200 Israelis were killed and 251 taken hostage in an attack led by Hamas. Israel responded with 2 years of genocidal warfare against Palestinians.
On this day 2 years ago, Israelis were left with shock, grief, and questions about how one of the world's most advanced militaries failed to protect them.
And Palestinians braced themselves as Israeli leaders vowed a destructive and indiscriminate retaliation.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור.
Western governments immediately pledged their support for Israel's war, and turnout among Israeli reservists hit an unprecedented 120%.
We stand with you. We stand with Israel.
Je condamne avec la plus grande fermeté l'attaque insensée menée par la Hamas contre Israël.
And my administration's support for Israel's security is rock solid and unwavering.
I thought it was very important to come personally to bring the solidarity of the Italian government and the Italian people.
This reaction hit not just Gaza, but the occupied West Bank. Settler attacks on Palestinian villages skyrocketed, and Israel's government approved the largest land seizure in 30 years.
But as cities in Gaza were razed to the ground, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faced increasing scrutiny from his own population as to how the 7th of October attack had gone undetected.
Hostage negotiations have seen 124 Israelis released, but 48 remain in Gaza, half of whom are believed to have been killed, after the government repeatedly squandered truce deals.
Hundreds of thousands of Israelis have attended weekly protests and nationwide strikes for the hostages' release, as well as calling for fresh elections. Still, Israel's government expanded its war, bombing Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Iran, and Qatar.
As it did so, protests against its war on Gaza swept the world. Legal groups accused Israel of committing genocide. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and other leading members of both Israel's government and Hamas. Western allies grew critical of Israel's actions. Several would recognize a Palestinian state at the 2025 UN General Assembly, bringing the total to 157 out of 193 UN member states.
Calls to boycott Israel in Hollywood, Eurovision, and UEFA are gaining momentum. Yet Israel continued launching new offensives, most recently in Gaza City, despite under a third of Israelis supporting this.
2 years on, undeterred by protests within Israel or isolation without, Netanyahu has refused to end the war. Gaza lies in ruins, and Israel's top security brass say the military can achieve no more.
Last week, US President Trump unveiled what he called a peace plan for Gaza, demanding the immediate return of Israeli captives and opaque new leadership to replace Hamas. Now, polling shows Israelis overwhelmingly support the deal, though the details are yet to be ironed out. But even though Hamas has agreed to the preliminary plan, Israel has continued to bomb Gaza.
As the death toll skyrockets, why is Israel still fighting the longest war it has ever fought? And how is that war seen by the population in whose name and national security it is waged? 4 guests will help us answer these questions in today's special. Ofer Kassif, Daniel Levy, Shel Ben Ephraim, and David Hurst. First, we are diving into Israel's politics, and here to help is Israel's Member of Parliament, Ofer Kassif. Welcome, Ofer, to Middle East Eye.
Thank you very much for having me. Good evening.
Now, over the past 2 years, we've seen different justifications given by Israeli officials for the genocide in Gaza, but the most common one is the events of October the 7th. Hamas is ultimately responsible. Firstly, is this the case still? In Israel's political chamber, is October 7th still the main argument for the ongoing war?
Well, yes, that was an excuse. I wouldn't refer to it as an argument, let alone as a reason, because that's a sham. That's an excuse. As I've been saying for almost 2 years, I have to say, not in order to flatter myself, but in order to make the right analysis which is a necessity in order to give the right solution. Already in an interview I gave on the 9th of October 2023, I said that the terrible criminal massacre that committed Hamas, which is my comrades and I, Palestinians as Jews in Israel, in my party, the Communist Party and Hadash, we condemned it from the beginning. We were against this massacre, this criminal massacre. But we said, and I said from the beginning, that it was used only as an excuse and not as a reason. The excuse was that 7th of October necessitates release of the hostages, and before that, what the government said is to reject or to eliminate any kind of security threat. But from the very beginning, this genocide, those atrocities that are committed still by Israel have nothing to do with the Israeli security, nor with the release of the hostages. It is the realization of the genocidal plan that was already introduced in 2017 by Smotrich, when it is entitled the Decisive Plan, and it was published all over the world in English as well, so you can even follow it. That was an excuse. The 7th of October, again, criminal massacre, has been used as an excuse to launch this genocide against the Palestinian people, nothing else.
You say that October the 7th was an excuse, not really the cause of what we're witnessing right now. But I believe you're one of a few voices only saying this inside the Parliament of Israel. Has that changed over the course of the war? Would you say you've gained any allies in Parliament for this view, or do you remain an outlier?
First of all, it's true. We've been in Hadash, the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality, the only Jewish-Palestinian partnership in the parliament for many years. We were the only ones that from the beginning opposed the attack against Gaza and said that the only way to solve the issues that are at stake, including the release of the hostages, is a political solution, which means ending the occupation. But and we were totally isolated and persecuted like many others. In Israel, one should note that from the very beginning, people who raised an alternative voice to this genocidal attack, and even to the government, and even to Netanyahu as a person, have been accused in treason, in supporting Hamas, in terrorism support, in terrorism or support of terrorism, and we were totally isolated. I personally, in the last 2 years, have been suspended from the Knesset altogether almost 300 days because of my struggle in not only words but actions, but mainly words against the genocide. And that included the support of most of the opposition against me and against my comrades. So we were totally isolated. But as time went by, more and more people, especially in the streets and among the demonstrators and protesters, later on a bit more in the Knesset, but much less, began to understand that what we were saying from the beginning bears some, rationale, and that it has nothing to do with the security of Israel, which is entitled to security. Nobody can undermine that or challenge that. We want to live in security, but we also know that the Palestinians need security and that the two communities are dependent upon each other in their security and future. So now you can see, especially as I said in the streets, more and more people, protesters, including among the families of the hostages and the victims on the Israeli part, that understand that this terrible attack, this genocide, which is often regarded as a war, I don't agree with the title, but that's not the point right now, began to understand and say so, that should stop. And you can see it even among some people on the right. For instance, the ex-chief of staff Moshe Ya'alon, Bogi Ya'alon, who was the chief of staff and also the defense minister in Netanyahu's government in the past, already said himself and joined in almost 600 ex-generals that Israel is guilty in war crimes and ethnic cleansing. And obviously you can see it more and hear it more among journalists and professors, teachers, social workers, physicians, etc., and the public at large. You can see a change, definitely. Perhaps it's too late, it's too little, it's not to the extent that I would like to see it, but still, it's better than nothing and never. There is a change. More and more people, now I can say absolutely that in the millions of people in Israel believe that this genocide should stop. And I hope it will.
So I gather you're gathering some more political allies in your criticism of the war. Nevertheless, it remains a very tense climate to speak out. Just a couple of months ago, one of your colleagues, I believe, was assaulted by far-right Israelis for his criticism of the war.
I was with him in the same place. We both were assaulted, almost lynched.
Yes, Ayman Odeh, he was assaulted. And I wonder how it is for you speaking up in the Knesset as a critic of the war. Do you feel free? Do you feel safe to do so?
Absolutely not. The violence toll in the streets, as well as within the Knesset, is on the rise all the time. As I said, my friend and comrade Ayman Odeh and myself, we were in a town 10 minutes from where I live, together. We went for a demonstration against the genocide, in where we were almost lynched under the auspices of the police, which didn't do anything to stop those the pogroms, the mob. So, and there are so many other examples. It's not only directed against members of the Knesset like us, but also I can give you another two examples very briefly. One is that you know that every year there is the commemoration day, which is officially the commemoration day for soldiers and terror victims within Israel. And there is an alternative ceremony for many years now, which is common to Palestinians and Israelis together to commemorate all the victims of the occupation and the hatred and the conflict, so to speak. And this year, the participants, there were so many participants that there was not enough space for everybody, so they screened the ceremony in different places. And one of those places in the city of Ra'anana, which is a bit northern than Tel Aviv, it was screened in a synagogue, which was attacked by a fascist mob who broke windows, etc., of a synagogue. We all remember where such things happened. And so there was a pogrom. And again, the police didn't do anything to stop it and didn't arrest anyone, and not to mention charge anyone. And another example happened about a month ago, or perhaps even less than that, when a protest tent by the Knesset in Jerusalem that was put there 2 years ago by a father of someone who was killed during the massacre of October 7th, and this tent is identified more with the left side of the political spectrum. It was attacked again by a fascist mob, and the people who were in the tent called the police, and for 90 minutes the police refrained from coming to protect them. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. There are many hundreds, if not thousands, examples. By the way, this is a penetration of the daily pogroms by fascist mobs against the Palestinians in the West Bank. And because they are not sanctioned, they are not stopped and arrested, they allow themselves, and their collaborators and supporters within Israel proper, allow themselves to follow suit, because they know they can do whatever they like against people like us. And they continue. And within the Knesset as well, as I said, I personally was suspended in the last 2 years, almost for one entire year altogether. And same about my comrades. Ayman Odeh himself was suspended altogether for a few months, either 2 months, 3 months as well. So there are attempts to silence us. One end is killing in Gaza and in the West Bank, and the other hand of the establishment is put over our mouth to shut us up. But we won't do that. We won't be silenced. We continue our struggle for the future and well-being of both peoples of this land.
Ofer, final question. You paint a picture of this silencing of critics, especially during the war. Israel has not only faced 2 years of war, it's faced 2 years of an emergency wartime government. Calls for elections have been shut down, calls to end the war have been shut down. How has this period impacted democratic institutions and democratic freedoms inside Israel?
Well, as I already said, the silencing attempts, the chilling effect of that, and the attempts to just, eliminate any alternative voice to the genocidal policy of the government, which is, alas, supported by many segments of the opposition, are under threat. People, so to speak, common citizens, by hundreds, were fired from the workplaces or thrown out from the studies at the universities or colleges because they raised a voice against the genocide or because they expressed sympathy for the children of Gaza. And there's a lot of violence by the police, for instance, which turned into a private militia in the hands of the government and especially of the so-called national security minister. And again, as I said, those examples are only the tip of the iceberg. And of course, there are also some laws and bills against basic civil and political rights. For instance, the freedom of the press is not only under threat, it's already partly eliminated. Same about the freedom of the judicial system. So we are talking about a full-fledged fascist regime that already exists in Israel. As was published a few weeks ago in Haaretz, we are not on the road to fascism. We are deep in the abyss of fascism already.
Ofer Kassif, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us a window into Israel's parliament.
Thank you very much. All the best.
Now, next up, we'll zoom in a little closer to the individual parties and politicians driving Israel's.
I'll be right back.
Here to discuss the motivations of the government at the helm of these political changes is British-Israeli analyst and former negotiator Daniel Levy. Daniel, thanks so much for joining us on MEE Live.
Of course.
So we've seen now the announcement of Trump's peace plan that Netanyahu has approved. There have been several ceasefire proposals over the course of this war. What has driven him to accept this one in particular, and why?
Well, first, let's understand what it is we're talking about. And the word peace plan, I don't think, is something that captures what has been put forward by the US administration. What you have is, I think, three things there. One is something that could conceivably bring, and that's really important, a ceasefire, an Israeli military withdrawal, release of hostages, release of Palestinian prisoners being held in Israel, the ramping up of the desperately needed humanitarian assistance. That's one basket. That's what's being discussed in Cairo right now, but it lacks detail. It lacks the guarantees that you're going to get to those phases of Israeli withdrawal, of humanitarian access. Then there are two other parts to it. One is to impose some kind of weird 21st century version of a colonial administration inside Gaza, headed by President Trump himself, Tony Blair and others. And then the third part, which is almost non-existent, is this idea that it will lead to peace, Palestinian statehood. West Bank isn't even mentioned in the plan. I say this because it helps you understand why it is easier for the Israeli prime minister, given his political circumstances, to accept. So that's one thing that's going on. But we should understand that even in nominally accepting such a half-baked and stacked in Israel's favor so-called plan, Netanyahu has already contradicted things in that plan and set his own version of it forward. He has said, contrary to what's written in the paper, there'll be no Palestinian state. And he has said, contrary to what's written in the paper, that the IDF will remain in the vast majority of Gaza. So I don't think we can say that this has Netanyahu's sign-off. I think Netanyahu is saying, look, if you can get Hamas to give the hostages back with limited deliverables on my part, why not? Anyway, I can go ahead and violate it later. And I think he's saying to his coalition allies, stay in the government, we'll be back killing Gazans, to put it bluntly, very quickly.
And we know, of course, that getting those hostages back is a top priority for Israeli society. Other elements of the plan, not so much. We know, for example, very little support for a Palestinian state. How are Israelis looking at the plan, looking at any potential concessions to Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere? Obviously, we know that Israel is due to hold elections next year. I wonder how that public reaction is factoring into the Premier's thinking.
Look, I think there is polarization, division, fragmentation in Israeli society. I wish I could tell you that centers around Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and whether indeed Israeli Jewish security can be achieved by imposing maximum insecurity and suffering on Palestinians. That's not the fault line. The fault line is, are you prioritizing the release, the return of the Israelis? Mr. Prime Minister, are you allowing, even by our standards, some extreme ministers to set the agenda? And so one of the things that Netanyahu will be testing constantly is how much maneuver room does he have with his coalition allies? Are they going to bring him down? Is he going to have to rely on the opposition? Is this perhaps going to be popular? Does the narrative that he offered Israelis on Saturday night, which is, this is part of my total victory, this is another victory, I've bent the will of the Americans and the region to my direction, is that going to play well? Because in the polls, he continues to lag behind the opposition, and he hasn't managed to close that gap until now. What I think is significant to understand is that you don't have an Israeli opposition coming to this and saying, we need a whole different approach to the Palestinians. You have an opposition which mostly consists of people who have served under Netanyahu in the past, some of whom have been deeply part of his own Likud party, some of whom have been part of the national religious settler movement. And if you look at the opposition leaders, Bennett, Lapid, Lieberman, Gantz, that applies to all of them. There is the leader of the small rump of what remains of the Labour Party called the Democrats, Yair Golan, to whom that does not apply. But we are not seeing a division in Israel in terms of a peace camp and a war camp. It's two versions of a war camp, largely speaking.
I wonder then, you mentioned a lack of political imagination across the aisle. I wonder then, where does Israel go from here? Because there's been this kind of recognition that the containment or management of the occupation pre-October 7th simply has not worked as a formula. But then there seems to be a lack of vision for what lies ahead. And in the meantime, as you say, a lot of polarization. We saw a sharp increase in emigration from Israel in 2024, one that far outstripped immigration into the country, obviously extremely torn over the fate of the remaining hostages, over the military draft. So there seem to be a lot of open questions in Israeli society. I wonder then, where does the nation go from there?
Well, it's deeply disturbing because it appears to be in a society in the grip of a genocidal doom loop. I mean, it's the manufacturing of consent around such extreme actions which we have to look at. So the media, the political class, who are critical of Netanyahu, are still repeating his narrative that this is all because of Hamas, that there is food, it's just Hamas isn't letting it get to Palestinians. It's Hamas's embeddedness in the civilian population which has led to this level of casualties when they acknowledge that there has been that level of casualties. So there's no real critique, real questioning of the fundamentals of this being cruel, collective punishment, cruel, disproportionate mass killing of civilians, the ethnic cleansing, the displacement. You have the formal leader of the opposition, Lapid, who even talks about voluntary transfer as one of the things that will need to still be on the agenda. Of course, there's nothing voluntary when you've destroyed everything. So the lack of imagination, I fear, does not apply to much of Netanyahu's own political class, because they have a very vibrant, if terrifying, imagination. And that imagination takes you to this genocidal, ethnic cleansing, total victory tilt. But the other part of the political map are basically saying, let's go back to containment. So what you see is essentially this choice between genocide or apartheid is what's on offer. And it's breaking that. It's offering Israelis something different, which of course exists amongst dissidents, amongst some of those who are protesting, some in the human rights community who called this what it is, some who have called from sanctions, but those feel like quite lonely voices. And the question is whether that can be broken if Israelis see a different incentive structure. If they see that this is not sustainable, Netanyahu has managed, and one has to acknowledge this, to get through this with the economy largely intact. He's run a form of military Keynesianism where he's put he's put money in people's pockets by ramping up the compensation that reservists receive. He had a relatively small debt to GDP ratio going into this, so he's flooded the economy with money, largely through giving such great compensation to reservists, which has been another way of manufacturing consent. But what if the incentive structure changed? What if that isolation which he warned of and which he clearly fears, and he even went back out again and said, it's not us who's isolated, it's Hamas. What if that isolation actually took practical, consequential forms in terms of Israel's trade, in terms of where Israelis can visit visa-free, in terms of Israeli participation in international tournaments? That's the thing that could break the grip that this genocidal doom loop has on Israeli society, because it could change the nature of the conversation. I'm not saying Israelis would say, hey, thank you so much for sanctioning us, but I think they would say, is this working for us? Is this good for us? Do we need to look outside of the alternatives of genocide and apartheid in terms of the political options that we should be considering?
So you see the thing that could remove, should we say, the grip that Netanyahu's political narrative has over the majority of Israeli society as coming from outside consequences, outside repercussions for their actions. It will not come from inventiveness within the Israeli political spectrum, at least for the majority.
I think it's the interaction between those two things. I think we can say at this stage with a significant degree of confidence, and you spoke to Ofer Kassif and he was describing the internal situation there. I think we can say with significant confidence that it's not going to be self-propelled. It's not going to be generated from inside Israeli society. So there is going to have to be this push and pull. And what Israelis, I think, have experienced, have lived, is cost-free extremism, that they could go on this journey to these genocidal policies and be treated with impunity. When that changes, perhaps a new possibility will emerge in Israeli politics, in Israeli society, in the Israeli discourse, one that we don't see today. Of course, one of the big challenges is how do you do that when you have a dysfunctional and divided Palestinian side? Because if cautiously make a South African analogy here, when Prime Minister P.W. Botha in 1979, Prime Minister then of the apartheid regime in South Africa, said, off the back of Soweto and other uprisings, we must adapt or die. He made some cosmetic changes, but it was the ability of the ANC to translate those changes into real challenges to the regime that ultimately led to apartheid's demise. In the absence of a unified, representative, strategic Palestinian challenge, all of this also becomes so much more difficult.
Yes, clearly a lot has to change in the Palestinian, Israeli and global landscape to get to that new possibility you're talking about. Daniel Levy, a British-Israeli analyst and former negotiator, thank you so much for speaking to MEE Live this evening.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Now, as Israel's political future hangs in the balance, attitudes within the country have radically shifted in the past 2 years. Here to speak to us about those views and what it could mean for the nation's future is analyst and commentator Shail Ben Ephraim.
Hi.
Shail, welcome to MEE Live. It's a pleasure to have you. So we're obviously speaking 2 years on from the October 7th attacks, and we know that the trauma of that day remains deep within the hearts of Israeli society. How do you think the events of that day have shaped attitudes within the country?
Yeah, on a meta-historical plane, it's still too soon to tell. It's hard. It's really hard to say what the long-term ramifications of October 7th will be, and I'll explain why in a minute. But in the short term, it's definitely strengthened existing trends that Palestinians are not a partner for peace, not legitimate neighbors for Israel, don't have legitimate existence, are a problem that needs to be solved using violent means. That's certainly the short-term consequences of October 7th. But there are also trends that are a little bit more hopeful. I'm old enough to remember the first Intifada. And when the first Intifada was launched in late 1987, there were similar trends in Israel. There was a strengthening of the right. There was a strengthening of a violent urge to repress Palestinians. But over the years, it became clear that violence wasn't able to provide an answer to the problem. And we have to remember, this was a very long time frame. Oslo was signed in 1993. The first Intifada broke out in 1987. So it took several years until that became clear. First, there was an attempt to, as Yitzhak Rabin said at the time, break their bones. And now we're in the break their bones stage, which has been a long stage. It's been 2 years. stage, and this time it's gone all the way to genocide. But the question is, and this ties into what the previous speaker was saying, what Daniel Levy was saying, will Israel be able to achieve its goals through violence? The most likely answer to that is no. There is an organization of the international community to stop this, very belated. We see what Donald Trump is doing right now. And so the question becomes, once it becomes clear to Israelis that they can't resolve this through violence, will they continue to pursue violence ideologically, or will they adjust their strategy? And that depends greatly on the international community. Now, Israeli public opinion is quite complex right now. There's a lot of people who feel that Israel is doing things that are immoral and unsustainable in Gaza, and then there's people who feel that not enough violence is being used, and then you have the squishy middle that are much more pragmatic. And I don't mean that in the sense that they're particularly moral, but they, for example, the media in Israel wants to stop the campaign in Gaza because they feel like it's not working, and because they feel like the hostages are at risk as a result. And what that tells us is that the media in Israeli still responds to pragmatic external stimuli, and that's where the hope lies.
One of the people who realized that violence was not the answer relatively early on was yourself. Your thoughts about the war notably have changed over the past 2 years, and you went from supporting Israel's actions to becoming quite a loud opponent of them. What changed for you, in an Israeli media environment that is said to be notoriously closed off to information and reports from Gaza and to criticism from the outside world? What changed your opinion where so many others have failed to come to that same realization, or perhaps are unwilling to do so?
I think paradoxically, the fact that I'm very plugged into the Israeli media system and have a lot of connections in the IDF and in Israeli security circles led to that. And the reason is, at some point, and this specifically surrounds the events of the torture at Sderot Iman, people who I'd been talking to, who were involved in all this, admitted to me that they'd been lying. They admitted to me that they'd been misleading the public intentionally. That includes journalists I've talked to. That includes people in the IDF that I've talked to. Because I have a relationship of trust with some of them, because they ultimately wanted to tell me the truth when I pressed them, they admitted that. They told me we knew all along that Sderot Iman, there's torture. We denied it. And then I started looking at external reports that had surfaced about Sderot Iman earlier that had shown the torture that occurred there. And that made me realize that Israel and their ecosystem is lying. Something that sounds trivial to most people, but when you grow up in the system, you're always taught, that Palestinians lie about everything and Israelis tell the truth. And even though we're a flawed system, ultimately we mean well, and so on and so forth. And when you start to realize that your system is the one that's lying, that causes a lot of changes. And the truth is, there's nothing that unique about my process, aside from the fact that I've been willing to talk about it. There are so many Israelis that are disillusioned. There are so many Israelis that are aware that what we're doing in Gaza is horrific. And what set the stage for that for a lot of people is the clear understanding that this government and the IDF are lying to the people. That is something that most Israelis completely understand. That's a shattering of a deep, naive trust that Israelis had in their media, in their military, and in their politicians throughout all these years. Israel's built on a sense that the government is what protects you against danger. It's very different from the United States, which was a rebellion against government authority, and therefore people are loath to believe that they're being lied to. But this entire mess around October 7th and the genocide and the way this government has conducted itself has broken that on a very fundamental level.
So despite that breakdown of trust, then you mentioned there's a lot of unease, the idea that they're being dishonest about their treatment of Palestinians. Why then has that breakdown of trust failed to translate into a change in the treatment of Palestinians? If, as you say, there's been a breaking of that pact, not only in how they treat Palestinians, but the trust that the government would work to release all the hostages and so on, why has that failed to translate into a wider policy change, political alternative to Netanyahu's government?
Well, there's two reasons for that. There's two major reasons for that. The first reason is more narrow. I'll start with that, and that's political. The fact that this government has been under siege by the vast majority of Israelis, in the sense that it's very unpopular, has paradoxically strengthened it. They know that if they go to elections, they're toast, a lot of these parties. Therefore, they do everything they can to remain in power, even though this coalition has not been working for a very long time. If there was any popularity to these parties, they long ago would have dissolved this government because it's not working. And this government is based on the most radical extremist right-wing elements in Israeli society and caters to them. That's on the more immediate plane. On the less immediate plane, the main problem has always been for the media Israeli that they feel that there is no alternative through a combination of the fact that there's terrorism and events like October 7th so an empirical reality, and also a lot of propaganda that all Palestinians are terrorists and support terrorism and so on and so forth, has led to a sense of, among the median Israeli that, yeah, we lie, yeah, we do things that are immoral, but the enemy is so craven, so violent, so horrible that they really leave us with no choice. And the average Israeli thinks that when you try to make peace with the Palestinians, they repay you with violence. A really strong turning point in that regard was 2005 when Israel did the disengagement. The Israeli narrative is we gave them everything they wanted, and they repaid us with violence, and that led to October 7th. So the main problem most Israelis have, which I'm not justifying, a lot of it is based on lies, is that there's no alternative, there's no partner. So even if you stop doing all this, what would you get? You would just get more terrorism. And since the squishy Israeli middle, the median Israeli, doesn't have a solution, that empowers the extreme right that does have a solution. When their solution is genocide and ethnic cleansing, they very clearly have an agenda and they push it. Meanwhile, the median Israeli doesn't have an agenda, doesn't have an alternative, doesn't have a policy. And a lot of that is because they feel like there's no one to talk to on the other side.
Yep. The lack of an alternative vision to that put forward by Netanyahu's government is certainly one of the factors that has kept this war going for 2 years. Shail, thank you so much. That was a fascinating journey into Israeli society and into your own ideological journey. I really appreciate you talking to us here at MEE Live today.
That was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So the war is continuing 2 years in, but for the first time, it looks as though a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, could be close. But where Israel actually goes from there remains uncertain.
I got a rookie producer this time around. What is going on? Leftist audio, leftist producer in the house.
It may be the case that the end is in sight, but at what cost and at what gain? To conclude the show, I'm joined now by MEE's own editor-in-chief, David Hurst. David, welcome back to the studio.
Thank you.
Maybe that is the first obvious question. Does this peace plan look like the end is in sight, or could we be sitting here in a year's time and having the same conversation?
It's not a huge loss given what the video was. Who cares what Trump and Netanyahu had to say anyway?
It feels like the end is in sight simply because I think Trump has shown some impatience with Netanyahu, and that's been very widely reported. I mean, that has got to be balanced by all the times he's let Netanyahu rip up a ceasefire agreement that his own Steve Witkoff had put together. So in saying that, as several people have been reporting, that Trump really has boxed Netanyahu in, what they forget to say is how much leeway he gave Netanyahu even since his presidency began. And then, of course, Netanyahu had this track record of tearing up peace agreements arranged by Joe Biden as well. And I think the count stands at about 8 or 9 now, different attempts. That was 7 before. So we've got to be very sceptical. But my gut is that this is the beginning of the end of the war so far. However, the actual plan that Trump and his advisors are operating from are so far away from reality and what is achievable on the ground in every respect that we have to be, it's a question of just taking the gains that we've got, which would be a stop in the war and a partial pullback of Israeli troops, particularly from the Netzarim corridor, which would be very important to get a flow of people back to their shattered remains. But Netanyahu has still got all the keys. He's still got total control over the amount of aid that goes in, the quality of aid that goes in, and the speed with which his troops pull back. And he'll be trying to maneuver the best possible outcome for this. So my feeling is, yes, I think this is the beginning of the end, but we're so far away from a viable plan that we've got to be very, very cautious about, what we're dealing with.
Right, because we're here marking 2 years since October the 7th. October the 7th didn't happen in a vacuum, and so in order for us to not be sitting here again having this conversation again, the circumstances that enabled October the 7th to happen in the first place, well, they would need to fundamentally change.
Yeah, that's exactly the point I'm trying to make, because what everyone has suggested so far is to turn the clock back to October the 6th. That's what they think they're going to achieve by having a multinational force in Gaza, by having no power or control by Palestinians of any nature. They're all just going to do the total legal and military authority has been taken away from anyone on the ground. And that's a lot worse than October the 6th. And we knew that October the 6th was impossible. let me just go back a little bit and just explain why I think we're in a new world here. We've had the biggest battle and the longest battle of the war, a bigger battle than took place in 1948. More explosive used than all the previous wars put together, several Hiroshimas created, the total destruction of society, a genocide. These things were never, they were tried before, but they never happened on this scale. And we can't just simply say, fine, all right, that's the end of the war, we'll just go back to a normality of 2.1 million people in tents. I don't think that'll ever happen. And I think while one can say that Israel has won the battle, Israel has lost the war. And that, why do I say that? Because something very fundamental has changed in these 2 years, and that is world opinion. Whether you look at it from the point of view of popular opinion, like the quantity and the frequency of demonstrations all the way around the Western world, in fact all over the world, or whether you look about the dominance of the Palestinian narrative on social media, or whether you look about the incremental changes, but still quite important changes of the political elites, more people than ever of the politicians, saying that we now need to recognise a Palestinian state. That's a huge shift that's taken place in 2 years. And I think it's an irreversible change. It's not something that will revert back to something that we call October the 6th, or revert back to a sort of international mandate, which is what they're trying on Gaza, like a repeat of the British mandate, only it's an international one. Right. And those things are really, really important. So I don't think that's going to change now, and I don't think Israel's image has been destroyed by this war, and they'll never be able to restore it. And that will have profound implications going forward. Israel doesn't yet realise it, but it can't actually put all these pieces back together again because its image has changed fundamentally in the world. And I think that will also have an effect on the Palestinian leadership, because obviously, again, the only options are a Palestinian leadership that is totally compromised. That has been a sort of Vichy regime. That's the only option left, and this has to change from the bottom up. That is a very, very difficult part that has to change the Palestinian leadership. But if the international pressure keeps up and doesn't stop, doesn't say, oh, hey, we're in negotiations now, as it did, for instance, after you had the first Intifada, then you had a whole period called Oslo, which is where the pressure was taken off Israel completely. And everyone just thought that it was going to become an internal matter of negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis. That cannot happen again. It is a global human rights issue, and it will stay a global human rights issue until apartheid, until occupation ends. And that's the big difference. That is the huge mileage that has been travelled in 2 years. It's a huge difference, and I think one needs structures, and that international pressure has to keep going, and then things will change on the ground.
Right, but then we I feel like we have this paradox then, because that reputational damage has been done. But if we look at politically where Israel stands now, and this so-called peace plan that Trump has drawn up, this seems to play far more into Israel's interests than into Palestine's, as you've laid out. Netanyahu appeared pretty happy about the conditions of the initial Trump plan. And so is Israel today celebrating greater political clout than they were on October 6th? While they've suffered this reputational damage, haven't they been handed a political victory by the US president?
Yes, that will always happen because of the sort of advisors that Trump has brought on board, which are all come from one small faction in Israel, and because of the money he's getting as well. That also comes from the same source. So they will always think that the snapback mechanism to any announcement will be in their favour. But my point is that they won't be able to employ that snapback mechanism for anyone outside that closed circle. Yes, the relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv is closer than it's ever been. And it's constantly reinforced with arms and constantly reinforced with money and more aid. But that's it. The relationship between Tel Aviv and Europe is probably worse than it's been for a long time, and certainly with the global south. And that matters because Israel is actually is much closer to Europe in many senses than it is to America. And if the European market just stops or changes, or people keep on demanding change in Israel, that will have a huge effect because it's basically on our doorstep.
Economically, and also I wonder for the security of the Israeli people, right? We're talking about October 7th. This was seen at the time as a huge attack against the safety of Israelis. Why did the world, or so many world leaders, support the war at the start? Because they believed, or they said they believed, that the security of Israelis were at risk. But in the last 2 years, Israel has exchanged fire not just with Palestine, but with Iran, with Lebanon, with Yemen, with Qatar. One will exchange fire, levied fire. And as you say, it's become pretty isolated on the world stage. So a question I have then is, are Israelis today safer than they were on the 6th of October, 2023?
Well, ultimately, that was a massive security failure by its army. And also by Netanyahu and the leadership in diverting so many brigades from the southern command to the West Bank, which was all about annexation and all about cementing or greed for land, if you want, and they'd left their southern flank vulnerable. And yes, it was a huge shock to them. I have a feeling that the shock consisted not only of the army letting their own guard down and breaking that historical pact they've had with Israeli troops, because it's a citizen army, that you give us your sons and we'll protect you. They broke that pact. But there was also this feeling of how dare the Palestinians rampage around us in the same way that we rampage around them. There's a much harder feeling to that. It was, who are these Palestinians to do to us what we do to them all the time? Are they safer?
A federal judge in Chicago has refused the Illinois Attorney General.
Here we saw that. Fuck. I think I'll leave it there. Free Palestine. Fuck Israel. Crush Zionism forever.
Where's your fucking badge, you pigs? We go hard for Palestine. We escalate for Palestine. We fight for Palestine. We give it everything we got. We do not work with the police. We do not point people out to the police. We do not lay hands on our comrades. When we go hard for our people, you stand out the way. If you ain't with them, stand out